I lay in a hospital bed recovering from emergency surgery when my stepmother decided to sell my car. She did not just sell any car, she forged my signature and sold my fully restored 1965 Aston Martin. While I was still under anesthesia, she signed the papers and handed them over to a stranger for a fraction of what it was worth. "You do not need it right now anyway," she told me with a straight face. I just looked at her quietly as my lawyer walked into the room, saw the document in her hand, and asked a question that would destroy her entire life. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to deal with entitled relatives who thought what was yours was automatically theirs. I have spent my whole life dealing with people who take advantage of kindness. My name is Cassidy, and I am 33 years old. I work as a senior corporate auditor and financial risk manager for a global firm. My job is literally to hunt down fraud, assess massive corporate risks, and dismantle financial lies. I spend my days tearing apart forged ledgers and catching people who think they are smarter than the system. Ironically, the biggest liability in my life was not a corporate client, but my own family. Growing up, my father Richard married Brenda when I was 10. Brenda was the kind of woman who viewed wealth not as something you earn, but as something you extract from others. She brought her daughter Sloane into the marriage, and from that day forward, I became the secondary character in my own home. Sloane was the golden child. She could do no wrong. While I worked my way through college and climbed the corporate ladder, Sloane spent her 20s bouncing between expensive hobbies and maxing out credit cards our father paid for. 2 years ago, Sloane married Dion. Dion is an African-American real estate developer who drives expensive cars and wears tailored suits. He talks a big game about his commercial property developments, but my auditor instincts always told me his wealth was a facade built on aggressive loans and shifting debt. None of that mattered to me until last Tuesday. I had been rushed to the hospital in the middle of the night for an emergency gallbladder removal. The pain had been blinding, and the surgery was complicated enough to require a few days of inpatient recovery. Waking up from general anesthesia is a disorienting experience. Your mouth feels like cotton, and the room spins in slow circles. As I blinked against the harsh fluorescent lights of my private hospital room, the sterile smell of antiseptic filled my lungs. I expected to see a nurse, or maybe just an empty room. Instead, I saw Brenda and Sloane standing at the foot of my bed. Neither of them looked concerned. They did not bring flowers or balloons. They did not ask how my surgery went or if I was in pain. Brenda was clutching a manila folder and wearing a satisfied smirk while Sloane was busy scrolling through her phone, acting as if my hospital room was just a boring waiting area. The monitor next to my bed beeped steadily, tracking my elevated heart rate as I tried to make sense of the bizarre scene unfolding right before my eyes. "Oh, good, you are awake," Brenda said, stepping forward. Her tone was brisk and entirely devoid of maternal warmth. "We have some family business to discuss." I tried to sit up, wincing as a sharp pain radiated from my abdomen. "Family business?" I rasped, my throat dry. Brenda opened the folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. She dropped it directly onto my lap over the thin hospital blanket. I squinted at the document, trying to focus my blurry vision. It was a bill of sale, a vehicle transfer document specifically for my 1965 Aston Martin DB5, a car I had spent 3 years and a small fortune having perfectly restored down to the original leather stitching. "I signed the paperwork for you," Brenda announced casually, adjusting her designer handbag. "I used that emergency medical proxy your father had from years ago. You do not need to worry about it. The car is already gone." I stared at the paper. The sale price listed was $150,000. The car was worth easily over $800,000 on the collector market. "You sold my car," I asked, my voice barely a whisper, but laced with a sudden icy clarity. "Dion is in a tight spot with his newest commercial real estate project," Sloane chimed in, finally looking up from her phone. "He desperately needed liquid cash this week to secure some permits. You are going to be stuck in this hospital bed for weeks recovering anyway. You do not need a sports car gathering dust in your garage. Family helps family, Cassidy. You make millions at your corporate job. You can just buy another car when you get better. Dion needed the money now. Brenda nodded in agreement, as if this made perfect logical sense. Exactly. Dion is family. We all have to make sacrifices to support his business. Besides, $150,000 is a lot of money. You should be happy I found a private broker willing to pay cash so quickly. It solves everyone's problems without any unnecessary fuss or delay. The sheer audacity of their entitlement hung in the sterile hospital air. They had forged my signature. They had stolen an asset worth nearly $1 million and sold it for pocket change to bail out Dion. They thought because I was drugged and vulnerable, I would just roll over and accept it like I had accepted their dismissive behavior my entire life. I did not scream. I did not cry. My mind shifted instantly into auditor mode, cold, calculating, and ruthless. I reached over and pressed the red call button attached to my bed railing. Brenda rolled her eyes. Do not be dramatic, Cassidy. The nurses cannot unseal a signed contract. Just as she said that, the heavy wooden door to my hospital room swung open. It was not a nurse. It was Harrison. Harrison is a razor-sharp corporate and trust lawyer who works directly for my firm. He was carrying a briefcase containing my updated living will documents. He stepped into the room, took one look at the tension, and then his eyes fell on the forged bill of sale Brenda was still gripping. He stepped closer, adjusting his glasses. He looked at the document, then looked dead into Brenda's eyes. His face went completely pale. Do you even know who paid for that car? He asked, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. Brenda scoffed, crossing her arms over her expensive cashmere sweater. What a ridiculous question. Cassidy paid for it, obviously. She makes a ridiculous amount of money sitting at a desk all day, while my son-in-law actually builds things in the real world. She bought it years ago. I am her emergency medical proxy, so I have every right to liquidate her personal assets if the family requires capital. Harrison did not flinch. He slowly set his briefcase on the small table next to my bed. He opened it, withdrawing a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy watermarked paper. His hands were completely steady, but his eyes were sharp. You are holding a fraudulent bill of sale, he stated, his voice echoing in the quiet room. That 1965 Aston Martin does not belong to Cassidy personally. It is a registered asset of the global auditing firm she works for. It is held in a secure corporate trust for tax mitigation and asset protection purposes. Sloane stopped scrolling on her phone. She looked up, her mouth hanging open slightly. A company car, she asked, sounding confused. Who gets a vintage sports car as a company vehicle? A senior partner who manages hundreds of millions of dollars in corporate risk portfolios, I replied, leaning back against my pillows. The firm purchased it as an alternative investment vehicle and allowed me to store it in my secure garage. It is corporate property. Brenda's smug expression wavered, but she quickly tried to mask her sudden uncertainty with anger. That is a lie. You are just being spiteful because you do not want to help Dion. I already signed the papers. I have the cashier check in my purse. The transaction is done. You cannot undo it. Harrison took a step toward Brenda, forcing her to take a step back. Madam, you do not seem to comprehend the severity of your actions, he said. His tone was professional, but completely ruthless. By forging the signature of a senior partner on a corporate asset transfer and accepting funds, you have not committed a simple family misdemeanor. You have committed federal grand larceny. Furthermore, by presenting yourself as the legal owner of a corporate trust asset to a third-party broker, you have committed corporate fraud. If those funds cross state lines or enter the banking system, we are adding wire fraud to the list of charges. The color drained from Brenda's face. She looked down at the paper in her hand as if it had suddenly caught fire. She dropped it onto my hospital bed and took another step back. You are trying to scare me, she stammered, her voice pitching higher. I am her mother. The police will not care about a family dispute. I am a corporate lawyer representing a multinational auditing firm, Harrison corrected her. We do not care about your family disputes. Our Security and Asset Management Division flagged the unauthorized transfer of the vehicle title 20 minutes ago. They have already notified federal authorities. Sloane grabbed her mother's arm, looking genuinely panicked. Mom, what did you do? Dion said it was just a car. He said Cassidy would just yell for a bit and then let it go like she always does. Brenda was breathing heavily now. She fumbled in her designer handbag and pulled out her phone. She dialed a number, her hands shaking so badly she almost dropped the device. Richard, she shrieked into the phone the moment my father answered. You need to get down to the hospital right now. Cassidy is trying to put me in prison. Less than 30 minutes later, the door to my room flew open again. My father, Richard, stormed in. He was out of breath, his tie askew. He did not look at the IV line in my arm. He did not ask how my gallbladder surgery had gone or if I was in pain. He marched straight to the side of my bed and glared down at me. What is going on here, Cassidy? He demanded loudly. Your mother is hysterical in the hallway. Sloane is crying. They are saying something about federal charges and corporate fraud. Have you lost your mind? I looked at the man who was supposed to protect me. For years, he had allowed Brenda and Sloane to use me as their personal financial safety net. When Sloane maxed out her credit cards in college, my father begged me to pay them off to save her credit score. When Dion needed a down payment for his first real estate flip, my father pressured me into giving them a loan they never repaid. I was the responsible one, the quiet one, the one who fixed their mistakes while they lived beyond their means. I did not do anything, Dad, I said calmly. Your wife decided to break into my private garage, steal a vintage car worth nearly $1 million, and sell it to a shady broker for $150,000 to bail out Dion. The only problem is that she stole from my firm, not from me. Richard turned red. His jaw clenched as he tried to process the reality of the situation. Then, true to his nature, he directed his anger entirely at me. Why did you not tell us it was a company car? He yelled, pointing an accusing finger at me. Why would you keep something like that a secret? You set a trap for your mother. I set a trap, I repeated, incredulous. By parking a car in my own locked garage while I was bleeding on an operating table. You always do this. Richard continued pacing the small room. You have so much money. You sit in your ivory tower judging us while your sister struggles to build a life. Dion is trying to build a real estate business. He had a temporary cash flow problem. Brenda was just trying to keep the family together. You should have communicated your financial arrangements better. Harrison stepped forward, intervening before I could respond. Richard, your daughter is recovering from emergency surgery. Your wife committed a federal crime. Blaming the victim is not a legal defense strategy. Richard turned his wrath on Harrison. You work for her. Just call your boss and say it was a misunderstanding. Tell them Cassidy gave Brenda permission to move the car. We will return the $150,000. We will figure it out. Do you want your mother to go to federal prison, Cassidy? Is that what you want? The check is already gone. Dad? Sloane cried out from the doorway. She was clutching her stomach, leaning against the doorframe. Mom gave the check to Dion an hour ago. He already wired the funds to pay off the private lenders for his commercial project. The money is gone. The silence in the room was absolute. Richard stared at Sloane, his mouth opening and closing without sound. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The money was gone. The car was gone. The federal authorities were already involved. Just fix this, Cassidy. Richard pleaded, his voice dropping from a yell to a desperate whisper. You are a senior partner. You know these corporate people. You fix things for a living. Call whoever you need to call and make this go away. We are your family. You owe us this. You are the only reason we are in this mess right now. If you had just answered your phone instead of being in surgery, we could have asked for a normal loan. You forced our hand, Cassidy. I looked at my father. I looked at his panic, his enabling behavior, his complete lack of concern for my physical well-being. He stood there demanding that I risk my own freedom, my corporate licenses, and my entire career to cover up a felony that his wife committed. He still expected me to play my role. He still thought I would absorb the damage to keep their perfect suburban facade intact. I took a slow, deep breath, ignoring the throbbing pain in my surgical incisions. "I cannot fix this, Dad," I said, my voice devoid of any emotion, and even if I could, I would not. My father stared at me as if I had spoken in a foreign language. The vein in his neck pulsed, a visible sign of his mounting rage. He took a step closer, his fists clenched at his sides. "You are choosing a piece of metal over your own mother," he hissed. "She is not my mother," I corrected him, my voice echoing off the sterile walls. "She is your wife, and I am not choosing a car. I am allowing the law to handle a felony. I cannot simply ask my firm to look the other way. The legal team has already flagged the missing asset. The corporate security division triggered the protocol, and the federal authorities have taken over the investigation. It is entirely out of my hands now." Richard opened his mouth to argue, but Harrison stepped smoothly between us. "The discussion is over," Richard Harrison said with absolute finality. "I suggest you retain federal defense counsel for your wife immediately. Continuing to harass a senior partner of our firm while she is under medical care will only result in additional charges of witness tampering and extortion. I will not hesitate to call hospital security right now." My father looked from Harrison to me. He saw the cold, immovable reality in my eyes. The days of me fixing their messes were over. He spun around and stormed out of the hospital room, the heavy door slamming shut behind him. Sloane scrambled after him, her face buried in her hands, weeping about the stress being bad for her pregnancy. I spent the next 2 days in the hospital, recovering from my surgery in total silence. The physical pain was sharp, a constant ache in my abdomen whenever I shifted positions, but my mind was remarkably clear. For the first time in my life, I was not managing the chaotic fallout of my family's poor decisions. I focused entirely on resting, following the doctor's orders, and letting the pain medication do its job. Harrison handled the corporate fallout, keeping the firm's executives updated on the situation. On Thursday morning, the attending physician finally cleared me for discharge. I moved slowly, buttoning my coat with deliberate care to avoid pulling at my stitches. I called a private car service to take me back to my luxury downtown condominium. All I wanted was to lie in my own bed, heat up some soup, and sleep for 12 hours. The drive across the city was quiet. The overcast sky mirrored the cold detachment I felt. When the black car pulled up to my high-rise building, I tipped the driver and gingerly stepped onto the sidewalk. The lobby of my building was an expansive space of polished marble and glass, usually offering a sense of sanctuary and achievement. I walked up to the secure elevator bank and tapped my key fob against the electronic reader. A harsh red light flashed. Access denied. I frowned. I tapped the fob against the sensor a second time. The red light blinked again, accompanied by a sharp error beep. That was impossible. I paid my association fees 6 months in advance. Having trouble getting upstairs, a voice echoed across the marble lobby. I turned around. Dion was standing near the concierge desk. He was wearing one of his signature tailored suits, but the usual effortless swagger of the successful real estate developer was missing. His tie was slightly loosened. The skin around his eyes looked tight and exhausted. He was holding a manila folder, tapping it nervously against his thigh. I stood perfectly still, assessing him the way I would assess a fraudulent balance sheet. "What are you doing here, Dion?" I asked. My voice was steady despite the sudden spike of adrenaline in my chest. Dion took a few steps toward me, trying to project dominance. "You are locked out, Cassidy. Your key fob has been deactivated, and the locks on your front door have been drilled and replaced." I stared at him, letting the silence stretch. I refused to give him the satisfaction of looking panicked. "You cannot legally lock me out of my own home," I said. "I own that condo." Dion smiled, a tight, desperate expression that did not reach his eyes. "Actually, you do not own it outright." he countered, holding up the manila folder. You lease it under a specialized rent-to-own corporate contract. And you made a very careless mistake years ago when you first signed the paperwork. You were just starting out, and your credit history was thin. Richard co-signed the original master lease. My mind raced back 7 years. He was right. Before my promotions, before I became a senior partner, the building management had required a guarantor. My father had signed the document. I had been so busy climbing the corporate ladder and managing my wealth that I had completely forgotten to update the bureaucratic paperwork and remove his name. Since Richard is technically still on the lease, Dion continued, his voice dripping with forced confidence. He has equal legal rights to the property. He came down here this morning, showed his identification to the building manager, and authorized a complete lock change. He explicitly revoked your access. The building staff had to comply. You cannot get upstairs, Cassidy. Your clothes, your computers, your comfortable bed. They are all behind a steel door you cannot open. The physical pain in my abdomen flared, but I forced my posture to remain perfectly straight. This was their counterattack. They knew they could not fight the federal charges, so they were trying to break me physically and mentally while I was recovering from surgery. They wanted to strip away my sanctuary and force me to submit. Dion took another step closer, dropping the smug act. The sheer panic underneath his suit was palpable. He looked like a man drowning who was trying to pull me under with him. Drop the charges against Brenda, and you get your home back, he said, his voice lowering into a harsh whisper. Call your lawyers. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. Make the federal investigation go away today. We are family, Cassidy. Do not make this ugly. I looked at my brother-in-law. I saw the sweat forming on his brow. I saw the slight tremor in his hand holding the folder. He was not acting like a man who just needed a quick cash injection for a real estate permit. He was acting like a man terrified of an audit. He was acting like a man who knew his entire financial existence was a house of cards ready to collapse. If he was willing to illegally lock a woman recovering from surgery out of her home over a car, he had a lot more to hide than a simple cash flow problem. I did not scream at him. I did not beg for my keys. I did not shed a single tear. I just looked at him with absolute clinical detachment. You are going to regret this, Dion, I said softly. I turned my back on him, ignoring his demands for an answer. I walked straight out the glass doors of the lobby, back out onto the cold city sidewalk. I pulled out my phone and dialed Harrison. They thought locking me out would make me weak. They had no idea they had just given me the perfect excuse to tear their entire lives apart. I stood on the cold pavement outside my building and dialed Harrison. He answered on the second ring. I told him exactly what Dion had done, using my father to exploit an outdated lease agreement and physically lock me out of my own home. Harrison did not waste time expressing outrage. He simply asked for my current location and told me a black car would be there in 5 minutes. The firm had a corporate account with the Four Seasons, and he booked me into a luxury recovery suite immediately. The ride to the hotel was smooth. When I arrived, the staff treated me with the utmost discretion. They escorted me to a sprawling suite overlooking the city skyline. It had a massive soaking tub, a king-sized bed with pristine white sheets, and a private dining area. The firm was paying for everything. Dion thought he had left me stranded on the street, but instead, he had just handed me a 5-star command center. I ordered room service, took my prescribed medication, and slept for 14 solid hours. The next morning, I woke up feeling significantly better. The sharp pain in my abdomen had dulled to a manageable ache. I ordered coffee and fresh fruit and sat by the window watching the morning traffic below. I was just starting to draft an email to my forensics team when a sharp knock at the suite door broke the silence. I tied my robe and opened the door, expecting housekeeping. Instead, I found a man in a beige windbreaker holding a thick manila envelope. He asked if I was Cassidy. When I confirmed my identity, he handed me the envelope, stated I was officially served, and walked away down the carpeted hallway. I closed the door and tore open the seal. I pulled out a stack of legal documents filed with the county court. I read the bold print at the top of the first page and felt a cold knot form in my stomach. It was an emergency court summons for a temporary medical conservatorship. My eyes scanned the legal jargon, rapidly absorbing the sheer audacity of what my family had done. Brenda and Dion had filed a joint petition claiming I was mentally unfit to manage my own personal and financial affairs. They attached an affidavit from a doctor I had never met, stating that the heavy narcotics prescribed after my emergency gallbladder surgery had induced a severe psychotic break. The petition alleged that I was suffering from aggressive paranoia and delusions, specifically pointing to my supposed false claims that my mother had stolen my car. They were asking a judge to freeze all my personal bank accounts, my investment portfolios, and my stock options, and to appoint my father, Richard, as my temporary financial conservator. I sat down on the edge of the bed, the papers shaking slightly in my hands. This was not just a defensive maneuver to stop me from pressing charges over the stolen Aston Martin. This was an offensive strike. They were trying to take control of my entire net worth. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. I picked it up and saw a text message from Sloan. It read, "Just give Dion the money he needs. Stop being so selfish. I am pregnant and the stress you are causing is hurting the baby. We just want to make sure you are taken care of since you are clearly not in your right mind right now. Do not fight the court order." I stared at the glowing screen. The manipulation was so blatant it was almost insulting. Sloan was using her unborn child as a weapon to guilt me into surrendering my life savings. She honestly believed that playing the victim card would force me to fold. I called Harrison immediately and told him about the summons. He was at my hotel suite within 20 minutes, accompanied by 2 paralegals. They spread the court documents across the polished mahogany dining table and began dissecting the petition. "This is a desperate move," Harrison said, tapping a pen against the affidavit. "To get an emergency conservatorship granted, they have to prove imminent danger to your physical or financial well-being. Using a fabricated psychotic break from painkillers is a massive overreach. The doctor who signed this affidavit is risking his medical license." "Why go this far?" I asked, pacing the room carefully. If they just wanted to avoid the federal charges for the car, they could have tried to flee. Trying to seize all my assets is a completely different level of risk. Harrison looked up, his eyes narrowing behind his glasses. "Because the car was never the main objective, Cassidy. The $150,000 Brenda got from that broker was a drop in the bucket. I did some quiet digging into Dion early this morning before you called. His real estate empire is not just struggling, it is actively collapsing." I stopped pacing. "Explain." "He has over-leveraged every single commercial property in his portfolio," Harrison said. "He took out massive high-interest loans from private lenders to fund his latest luxury development. But the permits were denied, the contractors walked off the job, and the lenders are calling in his debts. He is facing total bankruptcy and potential fraud charges of his own if his investors find out he has been moving their money around to cover his personal expenses." The pieces suddenly clicked together in my mind with terrifying clarity. Dion did not just need the money from my car. He needed my entire personal fortune to save himself from financial ruin and prison. He had convinced Brenda and my father that I was hoarding wealth while the family suffered. He manipulated them into believing that if they could just get medical control over my finances, they could legally siphon my money into his failing businesses under the guise of family investments. "They think I am weak," I said, my voice dropping to a low, steady pitch. "They think because I'm recovering from surgery and locked out of my condo, I will just let a judge hand them my bank accounts. They think they can drug me on paper and steal everything I have worked for." Harrison gathered the documents and placed them back into the envelope. "We have a hearing in 48 hours to contest the emergency order. I will have a team of independent psychiatrists evaluate you today to prove you are entirely lucid. We will crush this petition in court." I looked out the window at the sprawling city below. My family had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. They had weaponized the legal system against my sanity to rob me blind. No, I said, turning back to Harrison. Crushing the petition is not enough. They want to play a game of financial ruin. They want to open the books and use the law as a weapon. Fine. I picked up my phone and looked at Sloane's text message one more time. Stop being so selfish. Harrison! I said, my tone shifting into the exact register I used when dismantling a corrupt corporation. I want a full shadow audit of Dion's real estate company. I want to know every lender, every investor, every hidden offshore account, and every shell corporation he has ever registered. If he is moving money illegally, I want the paper trail. Harrison smiled a cold, predatory smile. I will assemble the forensic accounting team immediately. My family thought they were dealing with a vulnerable daughter they could easily manipulate. They forgot that I destroy financial criminals for a living. And Dion was about to become my next audit. I did not sleep the rest of that day. The residual effects of the surgical anesthesia and the heavy painkillers were completely flushed from my system, replaced by a cold, mechanical focus that I usually reserved for hostile corporate takeovers. The plush luxury of the Four Seasons suite faded into the background. I was no longer a recovering patient or a betrayed daughter. I was the apex predator of the financial risk sector, and my family had foolishly walked directly into my hunting ground. Harrison returned to the suite within 2 hours, and he did not come alone. He brought two of our firm's most ruthless forensic accountants, a veteran investigator named David and an intense data analyst named Naomi. They did not ask about my health or offer hollow sympathies. They wheeled in secure servers, portable dual monitors, and a heavy-duty encrypted router. Within 30 minutes, the opulent mahogany dining area of my hotel suite was entirely transformed into a secure corporate war room. We established a secure perimeter on the network, Naomi said, her fingers flying across her keyboard. We are masking our IP through the firm's offshore servers. If Dion has any digital alarms set up on his company records, he will not see us coming. Good, I said, pulling a chair up to the head of the table. I ignored the sharp tug of my surgical incisions. Let us build the profile. Dion operates under a primary umbrella corporation for his real estate ventures, but I guarantee he isolates his liabilities. David, I want you to pull every Delaware LLC registration tied to his name, his social security number, or his primary business address. Naomi cross-referenced those LLCs with property deeds and commercial loan registries in the state. David adjusted his glasses, staring at his screen. What exactly are we looking for, Cassidy? Desperation, I replied flatly. Dion has spent the last 5 years building a pristine public image as a trailblazing African-American luxury developer. He gives keynote speeches at urban renewal conferences. He sponsors charity galas. He wears bespoke suits and projects absolute financial dominance. But yesterday he aided in the theft of a corporate asset, and today he filed a fraudulent medical conservatorship against me. A man only risks federal prison and perjury for a quick $150,000 if he is bleeding cash from a severed artery. Find the wound. The room fell silent except for the rapid clicking of keyboards and the low hum of the servers. I logged into my own encrypted terminal, utilizing my senior partner clearance to access premium financial databases that regular citizens did not even know existed. I started pulling the public tax records on every piece of commercial property Dion had purchased over the last 36 months. It did not take long for the first domino to fall. I have a cluster of shell companies, David announced, pointing to a complex web diagram forming on his monitor. Dion is using at least 12 different LLCs. The structuring is chaotic. He is buying properties under one company, transferring the debt to a second company, and using the projected future value of the undeveloped land to secure loans for a third company. Standard aggressive leveraging, I noted, studying the screen. But where is the fracture point? Naomi leaned forward, her eyes scanning a rapidly scrolling column of data. The fracture point is the contractors. I am looking at the county clerk records. Over the past 4 months, 6 different construction firms have filed mechanic liens against Dion's 3 largest luxury development sites. He has stopped paying his builders. The properties are sitting half-finished. If the properties are half-finished, then he cannot lease them out or sell them. I said, my mind working through the financial logic. If he cannot sell them, he has no legitimate revenue stream. But he just threw a $50,000 gender reveal party for my sister last month. Where is the operating cash coming from? David tapped his keyboard, bringing up a new set of documents. Hard money lenders. He is bypassing traditional banks entirely now. The interest rates on these recent loans are predatory. We are talking 20 to 30% short-term balloon payments. He is taking out massive high-risk loans just to cover the interest payments on his older loans. I stared at the financial data cascading across the monitors. The picture was becoming terrifyingly clear. Dion was not just a bad businessman who got in over his head. He was actively engaging in a catastrophic financial spiral. He was borrowing from Peter to pay Paul, utilizing aggressive private loans to maintain the illusion of wealth, while his actual real estate empire rotted from the inside out. This explains the car theft, I said, my voice deadpan. He missed a balloon payment to a private lender. When you owe millions to traditional banks, they send you angry letters. When you owe hundreds of thousands to unregulated hard money lenders, they send people to break your legs. He needed $150,000 in untraceable cash immediately to keep someone dangerous away from his front door. My mother handed him that cash on a silver platter, and the conservatorship Harrison added, leaning against the wall. That is his endgame. He knows the hard money loans are unsustainable. He needs a massive injection of clean, legitimate capital to satisfy his creditors and keep his shell companies from collapsing into bankruptcy. He looked at your multi-million-dollar investment portfolio and decided you were going to be his involuntary savior. I picked up my phone. The screen was filled with unread text messages from my father begging me to answer his calls, demanding that I submit to the medical evaluation for the conservatorship. He was playing the role of the concerned patriarch, completely oblivious to the fact that his son-in-law was orchestrating the theft of my entire life savings. They think they have me backed into a corner, I said, dropping the phone face down on the table. They think I am isolated in this hotel room, terrified of losing my freedom. What is the next step? David asked, looking away from his monitors. We follow the money all the way to the bottom, I ordered. If Dion is taking on this much toxic debt, he is bound to be committing fraud to secure those loans. Nobody lends millions to a developer with a dozen contractor liens unless the developer is lying on his loan applications. Find the fabricated assets. Find the inflated appraisals. I want every single fraudulent document he has ever signed. The team nodded and returned to their screens, their fingers moving with renewed intensity. The hotel suite felt less like a recovery room and more like a tribunal. I sat at the head of the table, the physical pain in my body entirely eclipsed by the cold, burning desire to dismantle the people who had tried to destroy me. The shadow audit was fully underway, and my family had no idea that the financial guillotine was already hovering directly over their necks. By midnight, the empty coffee cups had multiplied across the mahogany table. The glow of the monitors cast long shadows against the walls of the hotel suite. My physical exhaustion was kept at bay by a steady drip of adrenaline and the sheer magnitude of the financial disaster unfolding on the screens before me. David had been tracking the incoming wire transfers to Dion's primary holding company, while Naomi ran cross-references on the outgoing dividend payments. I need you to look at this, Cassidy, Naomi said, breaking the tense silence. She turned her monitor toward me. I mapped the cash flow for the past 18 months. Dion has exactly zero incoming revenue from property sales or commercial leases. Not a single completed project has generated a dime of profit. Then how is he servicing the debt on the older properties? I asked, leaning in closer to study the cascading spreadsheets. He has been making regular monthly dividend payments to his early investors. I saw the bank statements an hour ago. He is not using revenue, Naomi stated flatly. He is using fresh capital. Look at the ledger for his newest development project. He raised $4 million in seed money 3 weeks ago. Within 48 hours of that deposit clearing, 80% of those funds were aggressively wired out to his older investors disguised as quarterly returns. The room went completely still. Harrison stopped reviewing a stack of printed affidavits and walked over to Naomi's workstation. I stared at the data, the numbers painting a stark and undeniable picture of criminal desperation. It is a Ponzi scheme, Harrison said, his voice deadly serious. He is entirely reliant on bringing in new investors to pay off the old ones. He is not building real estate. He is just moving stolen money in a circle to maintain the illusion of solvency. I sat back in my chair, the reality of the situation settling over me like a suffocating blanket. A localized Ponzi scheme operated by my own brother-in-law. The implications were staggering, but to run a scheme like this, you need a constant stream of gullible high-net-worth individuals willing to write massive checks without demanding a thorough audit of the underlying assets. Pull up the investor manifests, I ordered David. I need names. Who is funding this fraud? David manipulated his keyboard, bringing up a master list of private investors who had wired funds into Dion's shell companies over the last 2 years. I scanned the names scrolling down the monitor. My blood ran cold. Arthur Sterling, William Brentwood, the Kensington Family Trust. I know these people, I whispered, tracing my finger against the glass of the screen. These are my father's friends. They are his regular golf partners at the country club. The Kensington family hosted Sloane's engagement party. Dion did not just find random investors. He used my father's social credibility to infiltrate his inner circle. He convinced Richard's wealthy friends to hand over their money for guaranteed returns. Keep scrolling, Harrison said, pointing to the bottom of the ledger. I moved down to the most recent seed capital injection, the one that had temporarily kept Dion's house of cards from collapsing last month. The investor name listed was a joint revocable trust. It was registered to Richard and Brenda. The investment amount was $1.2 million. I felt the air leave my lungs. I pulled up my father's financial history, cross-referencing the routing numbers. The $1.2 million was not just spare capital. It was Richard's entire retirement portfolio. He had liquidated his pension, cashed out his long-term mutual funds, and mortgaged his remaining liquid assets to invest in his son-in-law's fraudulent empire. My father is completely broke, I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. He has absolutely nothing left. He handed his entire life savings to a man running a Ponzi scheme. And Brenda's lavish lifestyle, David added, pulling up her recent credit card statements linked to the same accounts. The designer bags, the country club fees, the luxury vacations. She thinks she is living off the massive returns from Dion's real estate genius. In reality, she is spending the stolen retirement funds of her own friends and neighbors. The irony was so sharp it almost physically hurt. My father was currently harassing me, flooding my phone with angry demands, trying to force me into a medical conservatorship. He believed I was a selfish hoarder of wealth who was letting the family suffer. He had no idea that the very man he was trying to protect had already vaporized his entire net worth. He was fighting to hand my corporate fortune over to the person who had secretly bankrupted him. But what about the car? Harrison asked, pacing the room. If Dion managed to scam your father out of over $1 million last month, why was he so desperate for the $150,000 from your Aston Martin this week? Why forge a document and risk a federal grand larceny charge for a relatively small amount? Naomi typed furiously, running a deep trace on the exact routing number where Brenda's stolen car funds had been deposited. She hit the enter key, and a red-flagged dossier popped up on her screen. Because he did not owe that money to a bank, Naomi explained. I tracked the wire transfer Brenda initiated after selling your car. The funds bypassed Dion's normal shell companies completely. They went straight to an offshore LLC registered in the Cayman Islands, but the domestic managing partner of that LLC is a man named Victor Thorne. Harrison let out a low whistle. Victor Thorne. He is a known entity to the federal authorities. He operates a high-level shadow lending syndicate. He is a loan shark for desperate executives. Dion borrowed money from organized crime. I realized the puzzle finally complete. The Ponzi scheme was not bringing in fresh cash fast enough to cover his lifestyle and his older investors. He took a short-term bridge loan from a violent syndicate to fake a dividend payment. When he could not pay Thorne back, his physical safety was threatened. He needed untraceable cash immediately just to keep from getting his legs broken or worse. That is why Brenda stole the car from my garage while I was on the operating table. Dion probably told her his life was in danger. He weaponized her maternal panic for Sloane and her own greed, forcing her to commit a felony to save him from a cartel. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling of the luxury hotel suite. My family was a hollow shell of lies. Brenda was parading around the country club wearing clothes bought with stolen pension funds. Sloane was bragging about her wealthy husband who was actually dodging organized crime enforcers. And my father, the man who had abandoned his duty to protect me, was aggressively trying to have me declared legally insane to bail out a criminal. They built a kingdom on top of a landmine, I said, my voice dead calm. And now they are angry at me because I refuse to stand on the explosive so they can walk away. What is our next move? David asked, saving the encrypted files to the secure server. Do we alert the federal authorities about the Ponzi scheme? Not yet, I replied, standing up from the table. If we drop this on the FBI today, Dion gets arrested and my family plays the victim card. They will claim they were deceived and use my father's bankruptcy to garner public sympathy. They will say the stress caused my supposed psychotic break, justifying the conservatorship. I will not allow them to control the narrative. I walked over to the window, looking out over the city lights. I wanted them to feel the exact level of helplessness they had tried to inflict on me. I wanted them to realize that their entire existence was an illusion, and I was the one holding the match. Sloane is hosting her extravagant gender reveal party tomorrow afternoon, I said, turning back to my team. Dion is throwing a $50,000 event to project strength to his investors and keep the illusion alive. I am going to that party, and I am going to let him know exactly who holds his leash. The following afternoon, a black town car dropped me off at the wrought iron gates of a sprawling country estate just outside the city limits. Dion and Sloane had rented the entire property for a single afternoon to host what could only be described as a monument to financial delusion. The $50,000 gender reveal party was in full swing. As I walked up the winding cobblestone driveway, I took in the sheer absurdity of the excess. There were twin ice sculptures carved into the shapes of storks flanking the entrance. A string quartet was playing contemporary pop songs on the manicured lawn. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos circulated among the crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with champagne flutes and gourmet hors d'oeuvres. Every single detail of this lavish celebration was paid for with stolen money. The flowers, the catering, the valet, parking, it was all funded by the retirement accounts of the very people standing on the lawn. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored navy blazer. I wore a pair of dark, oversized sunglasses and walked with a steady, measured pace that completely belied the fact that I had just undergone major surgery a few days prior. I did not look like a woman suffering from a psychotic break. I looked like a senior corporate partner who owned the ground she walked on. I bypassed the crowded greeting line and walked directly onto the main patio. I grabbed a glass of sparkling water with a twist of lime from a passing waiter. My presence did not go unnoticed for long. The subtle shift in the atmosphere happened almost immediately as heads turned and murmurs rippled through the crowd of wealthy investors and country club socialites. My father Richard was the first to spot me. He was standing by a massive floral arch, holding a glass of scotch. His face went entirely slack. He took a step toward me, then stopped abruptly, as if he had hit an invisible wall. He looked terrified, unsure if I was going to scream, throw a drink, or call the police right there on the lawn. Brenda saw me next. She was wearing a ridiculous pastel pink and blue dress, holding court with a group of older women whose husbands had likely poured millions into Dion's fraudulent company. Brenda's eyes widened in sheer panic. She abandoned her friends and power walked toward me, her heels clicking sharply against the stone patio. "Cassidy," she hissed, her voice a desperate strained whisper as she blocked my path. "What are you doing here? You are supposed to be resting. You cannot be here." I took a slow sip of my sparkling water, looking down at her from behind the dark lenses of my sunglasses. "Hello, Brenda," I said, my voice perfectly calm and pleasant. "It is a lovely afternoon for a party. The ice sculptures are a particularly tasteful touch." "You need to leave," she demanded, her eyes darting around to see if anyone was watching us. "We have a court order pending. You are not well. I will have security escort you out if you make a scene." "I am not going to make a scene, Brenda," I replied, offering her a chillingly polite smile. "I just came to congratulate the happy couple." I sidestepped her with effortless grace, leaving her frozen in place. I scanned the crowd and quickly located my target. Dion was standing near the edge of the sprawling infinity pool. He was surrounded by a group of older affluent men, the primary marks of his Ponzi scheme. He was laughing loudly, holding a cigar in one hand and gesturing expansively with the other, playing the role of the visionary real estate mogul to absolute perfection. I walked directly toward him. As I approached, the men in his circle noticed me. A few of them recognized me from corporate functions and greeted me warmly. Dion turned around, his charismatic smile still plastered on his face. When his eyes met mine, the smile shattered instantly. The blood drained from his cheeks, leaving his complexion an ashen gray. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously against his expensive silk collar. "Cassidy," he managed to say, his voice cracking slightly. "We were not expecting you." "I am sure you are not," I said, stopping just a foot away from him. I removed my sunglasses and folded them carefully, hooking them into the collar of my blazer. I looked him dead in the eye. "I would not miss this for the world, Dion. It is quite the gathering you have put together here." He leaned in close, trying to maintain the illusion of a friendly conversation for the sake of his investors, but his words were a frantic threat. "You need to leave right now, Cassidy. You are trespassing. The conservatorship hearing is tomorrow. Do not make me call the police." I did not raise my voice. I did not break eye contact. I leaned in even closer until my lips were just inches from his ear. "Cayman Islands routing prefix 084, followed by account number 772914. I whispered, my voice dropping to a low, razor-sharp frequency. "Registered to a Shadow LLC managed by Victor Thorne." I felt Dion's entire body go rigid. The glass of expensive scotch in his hand began to tremble so violently that the amber liquid sloshed over the rim and spilled onto the pristine stone patio. "I know about the liens," I continued, whispering directly into his ear. "I know about the predatory loans. I know about the fraudulent dividends you wired out last week using my father's retirement funds. And I know you stole my car to pay off a violent loan shark who is threatening to break your legs." I pulled back slightly so I could see his face. Dion looked like a man who had just stepped on a landmine and heard the click. He was hyperventilating, his eyes darting frantically around the yard at the investors he had robbed. He realized in that agonizing second that I did not just know about the car. I knew everything. I had dismantled his entire fraudulent empire in a single night, and I was the one holding all the cards. "I am going to enjoy watching you burn, Dion," I said, my tone perfectly conversational. I stepped back, taking another casual sip of my sparkling water. Dion was paralyzed, unable to speak, unable to move. Just then Sloane came marching over. Her face was flushed with anger, her hands resting aggressively on her pregnant belly. "What are you doing here, Cassidy?" she demanded loudly, trying to draw the attention of the crowd. "You are sick. You need to go back to your hotel before you do something crazy." I turned to my sister, offering her the warmest, most radiant smile I could muster. Sloan, I said, my voice projecting just enough for the surrounding guests to hear. I just wanted to drop by and wish you the best of luck. You have a beautiful party here. I hope you cherish every single second of it. Sloan looked confused by my pleasant demeanor, her defensive posture faltering. Congratulations on the baby, I added, looking from Sloan to the absolutely devastated shell of her husband. You two truly deserve everything that is coming to you. Without another word, I turned my back on them and walked purposefully toward the exit. I did not look at my father as I passed him. I ignored Brenda's frantic whispering. I simply glided down the cobblestone driveway and climbed back into my waiting town car. The psychological torture had officially begun. I had planted the explosive directly in Dion's mind. Now he would spend every agonizing minute of this $50,000 party wondering exactly when I was going to detonate his life. The next morning broke with unforgiving light. I was already sitting in my hotel suite sipping black coffee and watching the digital tracking software on my laptop. I had instructed Harrison to arrange a specific delivery for 9 o'clock sharp. Across town, Dion arrived at his luxury real estate office. He operated out of a financial district high-rise, paying exorbitant rent to project unshakable success. His office featured floor-to-ceiling windows and Italian leather furniture. But that morning, Dion was walking to his own execution. He had spent the night agonizing over the offshore routing numbers I had whispered in his ear. At precisely 9:15, a courier approached Dion's receptionist, handing over a sleek black gift box sealed with a silver ribbon. It was addressed directly to Dion, marked highly confidential. The receptionist carried the box into Dion's private office. He locked the door, tore off the ribbon, and lifted the lid. There was no handwritten note inside. Resting on a bed of black velvet was a single heavy silver USB drive. According to the tracking beacon embedded in the files, I knew exactly when he plugged it into his computer. At 9:22, the beacon pinged my server. The trap was sprung. When Dion opened the master folder, he found a masterpiece of forensic accounting formatted with the chilling precision of a corporate guillotine. There were 4 main directories. Folder 1 was titled Offshore Liabilities and Shadow Entities. Folder 2 was Fraudulent Investor Dividends. Folder 3 contained the unredacted mechanic liens and defaulted hard money loans. The 4th folder was the most terrifying. It was titled SEC and FBI Voluntary Disclosure Exhibits. I sat in my hotel room watching his access logs update. He clicked into the second folder. The screen populated with a timeline mapping every stolen dollar from Richard's retirement fund. It showed the exact timestamp when Dion diverted my father's pension to pay off older investors, creating the footprint of a Ponzi scheme. He clicked the offshore folder, finding the complete transaction history of the $150,000 stolen from my firm, tracing the money straight to Victor Thorne's illegal lending syndicate. Every wire fraud, every forged loan application, and every shell company was cross-referenced and backed by digital evidence. The presentation was formatted to the exact specifications required by federal regulatory agencies. It was a completed weapon requiring only one click to launch. Dion completely lost his mind. His breathing turned shallow, his hands shaking so violently he could barely operate the mouse. He spent years building a facade of invincibility, relying on the blind trust of my family. In a matter of hours, I stripped him bare and laid his financial crimes out on a silver platter. He was looking at 20 years in federal prison, and he knew it. In a panic, Dion grabbed his phone and dialed Brenda. She answered, her voice likely dripping with annoyance about my behavior at the party, but he did not let her finish. He began screaming into the receiver, pacing his office like a caged animal. "She knows everything, Brenda," he shouted, his voice cracking with hysteria. "She has the offshore accounts. She has the loan documents. She has the fake dividends. She built a complete federal profile on me overnight." Brenda tried to calm him down, dismissing his panic the way she always dismissed reality. "Dion, calm down. She is just trying to scare you. She is locked out of her condo and facing a conservatorship. She is powerless. She is not powerless, Brenda Dion roared, sweeping blueprints off his desk. She is an apex predator. You told me she just looked at spreadsheets. You told me she was a soft target. She just digitally vivisected my entire business. She has the exact routing numbers for the money I owe Victor Thorne. If she sends this file to the FBI, I am going to federal prison. If she sends it to Thorne, I am a dead man. He hung up on Brenda and immediately called my father. Richard was already on edge, terrified that I would contest the conservatorship. When he answered, Dion did not bother with pleasantries. "Richard, what exactly does your daughter do for a living?" Dion demanded, breathing heavily. "She is an auditor," Richard replied defensively. "She manages corporate risk." "No," Dion shot back, pacing frantically. "Normal auditors do not breach offshore shell companies in 4 hours. Normal auditors do not compile SEC disclosure packets that look like they were drafted by the Department of Justice. We picked a fight with a monster, Richard. She owns us. She has every single wire transfer I ever made using your country club friend's money." Richard paused, the reality of the situation finally beginning to pierce his willful ignorance. "What do you mean, my friend's money? Dion, what is on that drive?" Dion realized he had said too much, but the charade was over. "You need to drop the conservatorship hearing tomorrow, Richard," he pleaded, his voice dropping to a desperate beg. "You need to call off the lawyers. If we walk into that courtroom and try to declare her insane, she is going to hand this drive to the judge. She is letting us dig our own graves so she can bury us alive. We have to surrender." Dion slumped into his expensive leather desk chair, staring at the glowing monitor. The silver USB drive sticking out of his computer felt like a loaded gun pointed directly at his head. He had thought he was a brilliant mastermind manipulating my family to steal my wealth. Sitting in his ruined office surrounded by the evidence of his own destruction, he finally understood the fatal error he had made. He had mistaken my silence for weakness. Now he knew the truth. I was holding his entire life in the palm of my hand, and all it took was a sleek black box to prove it. I expected Dion to surrender the moment he realized the depth of his exposure. I expected him to drive straight to my hotel, fall on his knees, and beg for a plea deal. But I underestimated the sheer toxic hubris of my family. Instead of confronting the reality of his impending federal prison sentence, he chose the path of least resistance. He lied to Brenda and Sloane. He told them the USB drive was just a collection of fabricated documents that I had doctored to frame him. He convinced them that my shadow audit was nothing more than a desperate psychotic attempt to ruin their happiness because I was jealous of their perfect lives. And Brenda and Sloane swallowed that lie whole. They did not just believe him, they weaponized his narrative. If they could not beat me in a boardroom, they decided to destroy me in the court of public opinion. The smear campaign started less than 12 hours after the courier delivered the black box. It began with a highly choreographed post on Sloane's social media accounts. She uploaded a tearful video of herself cradling her pregnant belly, looking exhausted and traumatized. In the video, she claimed that her older half-sister had suffered a complete mental breakdown after a routine surgery. She spun a fabricated tale of how I had become obsessed with her husband, deeply envious of her pregnancy, and dangerously unhinged. She told her thousands of followers that I was harassing her family, forging financial documents to frame Dion for crimes he did not commit, and trying to tear apart their marriage out of pure, bitter spite. Sloane played the victim with terrifying perfection. "I am just trying to protect my unborn child," she sobbed to the camera, wiping away a single, perfectly timed tear. "My sister is deeply unwell. She needs psychiatric help, but instead she is using her corporate resources to cyberstalk and terrorize my husband. Please keep our family in your prayers during this nightmare." The video went viral within their social circles. Brenda took the campaign offline and brought it straight to the country club. She spent the entire afternoon holding court in the dining room, spinning a masterful web of deceit to the very people Dion was actively robbing. She painted me as a sad, lonely spinster who had sacrificed her sanity for a corporate career and was now lashing out at her loving family. Brenda told her wealthy friends that the medical conservatorship was a tragic necessity to save me from myself. She warned them that I might reach out with wild accusations about Dion's real estate firm and urged them to ignore my delusions. By evening, my phone was exploding. My personal email inbox flooded with messages from distant relatives and family friends. A cousin I had not spoken to in 5 years sent a scathing text accusing me of being a bitter, barren career woman who wanted to destroy what I could not have. The sheer volume of the hatred was staggering. They were trying to drown me in public shame, hoping the social pressure would break my resolve and force me to retreat. I sat at the mahogany dining table in my hotel suite, watching the social media notifications cascade across my phone screen. I did not shed a tear. I did not feel the urge to draft a frantic public defense. I simply watched the notifications roll in, observing their desperation masquerading as righteous indignation. Then a new voicemail notification popped up. The caller ID displayed my father's name. I placed the phone in the center of the table and pressed the speaker button. Harrison, who was sitting across from me reviewing a stack of federal court filings, paused his work. We listened to the recording together. Richard's voice echoed through the quiet suite, trembling with absolute fury. Cassidy, I have just seen Sloane's video and spoken with your mother. I am utterly appalled. I knew you were struggling, but I never imagined you were capable of this level of sheer, vindictive evil. To attack your pregnant sister to try and frame Dion with fake financial records just because you are jealous of their happiness. It is sick. You are sick. We tried to get you help. We tried to protect you with the conservatorship, but you have chosen to burn this family to the ground instead. He took a ragged breath, and when he spoke again, his tone was completely devoid of any paternal warmth. You have crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. You are a disgrace to the family name. I am officially washing my hands of you. Do not call me. Do not come near our home. You are no longer my daughter. I have to protect my real family from your toxicity. We will see you in court for the conservatorship hearing, and I will make sure the judge knows exactly how dangerous you have become. The voicemail ended with a sharp click. The room fell silent save for the low hum of the encrypted servers. My own father had just disowned me over a voicemail to protect a man who had stolen his entire life savings. He had chosen the comfortable lie over the devastating truth. He wanted so desperately to believe in the illusion of his perfect wealthy family that he willingly discarded his own flesh and blood to maintain the facade. He called me a disgrace to the family name while entirely oblivious to the fact that his name was currently on a fraudulent deed tied to a criminal syndicate. Harrison looked up from his legal pads, adjusting his glasses. He did not offer any empty condolences. He knew I did not need them. Instead, he tapped his pen against a freshly printed document. They are doubling down. Harrison observed his voice, clinical and precise. They think controlling the social narrative will somehow invalidate the financial evidence. It is a common panic response for white-collar criminals. They try to discredit the whistleblower when they cannot dispute the data. Let them scream, I said, my voice matching his cold detachment. Let them post their tearful videos and gather their country club sympathy. They are just building a taller pedestal to fall from. Are the final filings ready? Harrison slid a thick manila folder across the table. The trap was perfectly set. He had spent the afternoon finalizing the exact legal maneuvers that would trigger the collapse of their entire world. The social media circus was nothing but a distraction, a loud, colorful smokescreen hiding the fact that the federal machinery was already in motion. The paperwork is finalized, Harrison confirmed, tapping the cover of the folder. Corporate security has officially signed off. We are not just holding the evidence anymore, Cassidy. We are executing the strike. The grand larceny charges for the Aston Martin are moving from our internal division directly to the federal marshals. I looked down at the folder. My family thought they were winning a public relations war. They had no idea they had just brought a smartphone camera to a federal indictment. They wanted to play the victims for their friends. I was going to let them play the defendants for the judge. Execute the strike, I commanded. Bring down the hammer. Harrison nodded and tapped a single key on his encrypted laptop. It is done. He stated, his voice devoid of any hesitation. The firm's general counsel has authorized the release of the evidence. The digital files have been transmitted directly to the Department of Justice and the federal prosecutor's office. I sat back in my chair and took a slow sip of my coffee. The machinery of a multi-billion-dollar global auditing firm had just been unleashed. When a corporate asset worth nearly $1 million is stolen and liquidated across state lines, federal law enforcement does not drag its feet. They do not treat it like a minor domestic dispute over a borrowed sedan. They treat it as an organized strike against the financial system. My family thought they had cleverly outmaneuvered a vulnerable relative, but they had actually triggered a massive corporate defense protocol. Miles away from my hotel suite, Brenda was currently enjoying the pinnacle of her fabricated social existence. She was attending an exclusive charity luncheon at the prestigious Oakmont Country Club. This was her favorite battlefield. The dining room was filled with crystal chandeliers, towering floral arrangements, and the wealthiest socialites in the city. Many of the women sitting at her table were married to the very men Dayon was actively defrauding. Brenda sat at the center of it all, wearing a pristine white designer dress, sipping a mimosa, and basking in the sympathetic attention she had garnered from Sloane's viral smear campaign. She was playing the role of the beleaguered but loving mother to absolute perfection. She dabbed her eyes with a linen napkin, whispering tragic lies to her captive audience. She told the wives of high-profile executives that I had completely lost my grip on reality. She claimed that my high-pressure corporate job had driven me to severe paranoia, resulting in a heartbreaking mental collapse. She sighed heavily, telling them how deeply it pained her to file for a medical conservatorship, but that it was the only way to protect me from destroying my own life. Her friends murmured their condolences, reaching out to pat her hand, offering their unwavering support for her difficult familial burden. Brenda was completely intoxicated by her own performance. She felt untouchable, surrounded by the elite, shielding herself with the armor of a country club privilege. That illusion of safety shattered precisely at 1:15 in the afternoon. The heavy mahogany doors of the country club dining room swung open. The serene atmosphere of clinking silverware and classical background music was abruptly punctured by the arrival of three men who clearly did not belong at a charity luncheon. They wore dark tactical suits, and their expressions were entirely devoid of social courtesy. They were United States federal marshals, and they carried the absolute authority of the federal government. A heavy silence swept across the room like a cold front. The waitstaff froze in their tracks. The wealthy patrons turned in their chairs, their hushed conversations dying out instantly as the three marshals walked directly through the sea of pastel dresses and fine china. They did not stop at the reception desk. They marched in a straight, unwavering line toward the center table. Brenda lowered her mimosa glass, her perfectly manicured eyebrows knitting together in confusion. She watched the men approach, assuming they were lost, or perhaps looking for a member of the club's management staff. She adjusted her posture, preparing to exercise her usual arrogant dismissal of working-class individuals who dared to interrupt her social engagements. "Are you Brenda Hayes, the lead marshal?" asked his voice, cutting through the quiet dining room. He did not lower his volume to preserve her dignity. He spoke with the commanding projection of a law enforcement officer executing a high-level warrant. Brenda offered a tight, condescending smile. "Yes, I am," she replied, lifting her chin defensively. "But we are in the middle of a private charity event. Whatever this is about, you will have to speak to the club manager or contact my husband at his office. We do not handle solicitations or security matters during lunch." The marshal did not blink. He reached inside his jacket and pulled out a thick-bound legal document. He dropped it directly onto the center of the table, knocking over a crystal water glass. The water spilled across the white linen tablecloth, soaking into the floral centerpieces. "Brenda Hayes, you are hereby served with a federal subpoena and formal notice of indictment," the marshal announced, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "You are facing charges of federal grand larceny, wire fraud, and the interstate trafficking of stolen corporate assets." You are required to surrender your passport immediately and present yourself to the federal courthouse at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning for your preliminary arraignment. The women at Brenda's table gasped, physically recoiling in their chairs. Brenda's face drained of all color, leaving her looking violently ill. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. She stared at the thick stack of federal documents resting in the puddle of spilled water. "This is a mistake," she finally stammered, her voice trembling wildly. She looked around at her friends, desperate to maintain her facade. "This is just a terrible misunderstanding. It is a family dispute. My stepdaughter is mentally unwell. She is making false claims about a car I sold for her. It was just a family car." The marshal stepped closer, leaning over the table. "This is not a domestic dispute, ma'am," he stated loudly, entirely dismantling her lie in front of the entire country club. "You did not sell a family car. You forged the signature of a senior corporate partner and illegally liquidated a registered corporate trust asset valued at $850,000. Brenda gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white. "I gave the car to a private broker," she pleaded, tears of genuine terror welling in her eyes. "I did not steal anything, I just used a medical proxy. It was a private transaction." The marshal's expression hardened into pure disdain. The revelation he delivered next hit Brenda with the force of a freight train. "The private broker you transacted with is Victor Thorne," the marshal declared. "He is an internationally flagged fence for a criminal syndicate. He specializes in laundering stolen luxury assets and smuggling them overseas. By forging that title and transferring a corporate asset to his Shadow LLC, you facilitated an international smuggling operation. You are now officially tied to an ongoing federal investigation into organized crime." The collective gasp from the surrounding tables was audible. Brenda's wealthy friends pushed their chairs back, literally distancing themselves from her. The woman who just moments ago was the tragic hero of their social circle was now exposed as a federal criminal involved with international smuggling and loan sharks. Her country club reputation evaporated in a matter of seconds, entirely replaced by radioactive scandal. "I did not know," Brenda sobbed, openly weeping now as the reality of federal prison loomed over her. "My son-in-law Dion told me to do it. He gave me the broker's name. He took the money. I did not know who that man was." The marshal remained unmoved. "You can explain your relationship with Mr. Thorne to the federal judge tomorrow morning," he said, turning to leave. "Do not attempt to leave the state." The marshals walked out of the dining room, leaving Brenda completely isolated in a sea of horrified stares. She sat trembling uncontrollably amid the ruined luncheon, her entire social universe permanently destroyed. Back in the safety of my hotel suite, Harrison received the confirmation text. He looked up from his phone and met my gaze. "The marshals have served her," he confirmed. "The entire country club watched it happen." She tried to blame Dion for the criminal connections. I took another sip of my coffee, feeling the warmth spread through my chest. The smear campaign was dead. The dominoes were falling exactly as planned, and the crash was deafening. The panic that consumed my family's suburban estate that evening must have been truly spectacular to witness. Brenda fled the country club in absolute disgrace, her designer heels practically slipping on the marble floors as she scrambled to her luxury SUV. When she arrived home, she was hyperventilating, clutching the federal subpoena to her chest like a shield that could not protect her. Richard was already in the living room, pacing the length of their Persian rug, while Dion screamed at him through the speakerphone. The illusion of their untouchable wealth had evaporated in a matter of hours. The fraudulent medical conservatorship they had banked on was now entirely useless. You cannot declare someone mentally unfit to manage their personal checking account when they are actively orchestrating a multinational federal audit and working directly with the Department of Justice. The judge would throw their petition out the moment Harrison walked into the courtroom and handed over the federal case file. They were cornered and cornered. People make catastrophic financial mistakes. I sat at the dining table in my hotel suite listening to Harrison outline their most likely next moves. Richard is a creature of privilege, I explained to my team, my voice steady and analytical. He operates under the delusion that enough money can make any problem disappear. He thinks the federal government operates like a country club disciplinary committee. He believes that if he can just scrape together $150,000 to reimburse my firm, we will simply drop the grand larceny charges and apologize for the inconvenience. Harrison scoffed, shaking his head. The Department of Justice does not do refunds, Cassidy. The crime was committed the moment Brenda forged your signature and transferred a corporate asset to a known international fence. Returning the cash now only proves her guilt. But Richard does not know that, I said, leaning forward. And Dion is likely manipulating him further. Dion knows the SEC and the FBI are breathing down his neck because of the USB drive. He needs a massive injection of clean capital to pay off the furious contractors and silence the wealthy investors before they demand an audit of their missing retirement funds. He is going to bleed my father dry to save himself. Naomi typed rapidly on her keyboard, her eyes fixed on the dual monitors. If they need millions of dollars in clean liquid capital, immediately they only have one option left, she stated. They cannot use the stock market because Richard already liquidated his portfolios for Dion's Ponzi scheme. Their credit lines are maxed out. That leaves physical real estate. David brought up a satellite image of my father's sprawling property, the family estate. It sits on 4 acres of prime suburban land. It boasts a custom-built mansion, a pool house, and a tennis court. It is completely unencumbered by any primary mortgage. Richard paid it off over a decade ago. It is worth at least $4 million on the current market. I stared at the image of the house I grew up in, the house where I had been treated like a second-class citizen while Sloane was given everything she ever demanded. Richard and Brenda were incredibly proud of that estate. It was the physical manifestation of their perceived superiority. And now, out of sheer terror of federal prison, they were preparing to leverage it. They are going to try and take out a massive second mortgage, I predicted, watching the data stream across David's screen. A cash-out refinance. Richard will leverage the entire property for $3 million. He will use a fraction to try and pay back my firm and hand the rest directly to Dion to plug the holes in the fraudulent real estate development. Harrison frowned, tapping his pen against a legal pad. If Richard owns the house outright, he can secure a commercial equity loan relatively quickly, especially with his longtime private banker. They could have the funds wired within a matter of days. That gives Dion the capital he needs to temporarily pacify the loan sharks and investors. I let a slow, cold smile spread across my face. I looked at Harrison, and then at the projected image of the massive estate. Richard does not own that house outright, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. The entire room went silent. David stopped typing. Harrison lowered his pen, his legal mind instantly catching the scent of blood in the water. Explain, he demanded. Richard bought that property 30 years ago. I began folding my hands on the table, but he did not buy it alone. He purchased it during his marriage to my biological mother. She contributed heavily to the initial down payment and the early mortgage installments. When she passed away, her will was extremely specific regarding her assets. Her exact 50% equity stake in that property bypassed Richard entirely and was placed into a dormant trust with me as the sole beneficiary. Naomi gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. You own half the estate. I nodded, leaning back in my chair. When I turned 21, the trust dissolved and the equity transferred directly to my name. I never forced a partition sale because I had already moved out, and I was busy building my own career. I did not need the money, and I wanted nothing to do with them. Richard simply continued living there with Brenda and Sloane, acting as if the house belonged entirely to him. His ego is so massive he conveniently forgot that my name is permanently grafted to the underlying deed. Harrison let out a sharp laugh of pure disbelief. If your name is on the deed, Richard cannot legally encumber the property without your explicit notarized consent. Any bank will run a basic title search before approving a multi-million-dollar cash-out refinance. Exactly? I said, my eyes locked on the monitor. Richard is panicking. He is rushing to his private banker trying to quietly secure a lifeline. He is going to fill out the loan application claiming sole ownership of the collateral. He will sign federal banking documents stating the property is free and clear of any other equity claims. David caught on immediately, his fingers returning to the keyboard with lightning speed. If he signs a bank loan application claiming sole ownership of a property you hold 50% equity in, he is committing a felony. Mortgage fraud. I confirmed my tone devoid of any sympathy. He is trying to save his wife from a grand larceny charge by stepping directly into a federal banking crime of his own. And the best part is, we do not even have to do anything to stop him. We just have to let the bank do its job. I turned to Naomi. Set an alert on the county clerk database. Monitor any title search inquiries pulled on that specific address. The moment Richard's bank initiates the underwriting process, we will know. They were scrambling in the dark, desperately trying to build a bridge out of their collapsing empire. They had no idea they were building it directly over an active volcano that belonged to me. The remortgage ploy was not a lifeline. It was a noose, and Richard was happily tying it around his own neck. The heavy glass doors of the elite private wealth management branch in downtown reflected the gray, overcast sky as Richard and Brenda pushed their way inside. They walked with the stiff, exaggerated posture of people pretending they were not entirely consumed by panic. Brenda wore dark, oversized sunglasses indoors, attempting to hide her swollen, bloodshot eyes. The public humiliation of being served a federal subpoena at her country club had shattered her completely, but desperation had forced her to put on a designer trench coat and play the role of the wealthy matriarch one last time. Richard strode up to the reception desk, projecting the false authority he had relied on his entire life. He demanded to see Charles, his private wealth manager, immediately. They were escorted into a sprawling corner office lined with dark mahogany panels and thick leather chairs. This was a room designed to make clients feel powerful and untouchable. Richard took a seat, crossing his legs and adjusting his tie, while Brenda sat rigidly beside him, clutching her handbag as if it contained her last breath of oxygen. They had come for a $3 million cash-out refinance on the family estate. To Richard, this was a mere formality. He had banked with this institution for 15 years. He fully expected Charles to slide a single sheet of paper across the desk, offer a reassuring handshake, and wire the funds directly into Dawn's failing accounts before the end of the business day. Charles entered the office carrying a sleek leather folder. He offered a polite but tight smile, taking his seat behind the massive desk. Richard did not waste time with pleasantries. He aggressively outlined his demand, stating he needed to leverage the equity in his suburban estate immediately. He claimed it was a temporary measure to capitalize on a time-sensitive commercial real estate venture with his son-in-law. He pushed the completed loan application across the desk, his signature already scrawled at the bottom, declaring himself the sole owner of the collateral. Charles reviewed the application, nodding slowly. Given your history with our institution, Richard J. will personally walk this down to the underwriting department to expedite the approval, Charles said, standing up. I just need to run the standard compliance checks and verify the title clearance. It should only take a few minutes. Charles exited the room, closing the heavy door behind him. Left alone, Brenda let out a shaky breath and leaned toward my father. Dawn texted me twice since we walked in the building, she whispered, her voice trembling. The private lenders are calling his office every 10 minutes. We need this wire transfer today, Richard. We have to pay Cassidy's firm back for that stolen car and get the federal marshals off my back. Richard patted her hand, projecting a hollow confidence. It is handled, Brenda. Charles will approve the loan. We will wire the $150,000 to Cassidy's corporate lawyers, and they will drop the charges. We will inject the rest of the capital into Dion's company to quiet the investors. By tomorrow, this entire nightmare will be nothing but a bad memory. Cassidy thought she could ruin us, but she forgot who she is dealing with. They sat in the quiet luxury of the office, convincing themselves that money could simply erase their crimes. They believed they had successfully navigated their way out of the disaster. 20 minutes passed, then 30. Brenda began to tap her designer heel nervously against the carpet. The longer they waited, the more the oppressive silence of the room seemed to suffocate them. Finally, the office door clicked open. Charles walked back into the room, but his demeanor had entirely changed. He was not holding the champagne typically offered to celebrate a major financial transaction. He was not holding the signature portfolio. He was pale, his brow glistening with a light sheen of sweat. He looked at Richard with a mixture of deep discomfort and absolute terror. Charles sat down heavily behind his desk. He placed Richard's loan application flat on the table and folded his hands over it. He did not smile. "Richard, I do not know how to tell you this." Charles began, his voice completely stripped of its usual corporate warmth. "The loan is denied. I cannot authorize the refinance. In fact, I cannot authorize any transaction on your accounts." Richard froze. He stared at the banker as if Charles had just spoken to him in a foreign language. "Denied," Richard barked, slamming his hand on the armrest of his leather chair. "What do you mean, denied? I have an unencumbered estate worth $4 million. I have been a premium client here for over a decade. You process this override right now, Charles, or I am moving every single asset I possess to a competitor by the end of the day." "You do not have any assets to move, Richard," Charles replied, his tone dropping to a grim whisper. "The bank's risk management division just locked your entire financial profile. Your accounts are frozen. Your credit lines are suspended." Brenda let out a sharp gasp, gripping the edge of the desk. "Why?" she demanded, her voice cracking. Charles took a deep breath, adjusting his collar as if it had suddenly grown too tight. 48 hours ago, a massive corporate entity executed a hostile buyout in the commercial lending sector. They purchased a massive portfolio of high-risk distressed commercial debts from multiple institutions, including ours. That specific portfolio included every single one of Dion's defaulted commercial real estate loans. Richard's face drained of color. "What does Dion's commercial debt have to do with my personal mortgage refinance?" "Everything," Charles explained grimly. "Because you acted as a financial guarantor on Dion's initial development loans years ago, your personal accounts are cross-collateralized with his commercial failures. The corporate entity that purchased Dion's toxic debt now legally controls the leverage. They issued a blanket freeze on all connected assets to prevent capital flight. They specifically flagged your estate to prevent unauthorized liquidation." Furthermore, Charles continued, pulling a printed alert from his folder. "The title search on your property came back flagged. You signed this loan application claiming sole ownership under penalty of federal perjury. But the deed clearly shows a 50% equity hold belonging to a dormant trust registered to another individual. You attempted to leverage an asset you do not fully own to pay off a criminal debt network." Richard was paralyzed. The walls of the luxurious office were rapidly closing in on him. He had walked into the bank expecting a lifeline, and instead he had walked directly into a financial bear trap. "Who bought the debt?" Richard rasped, his voice barely audible. "What is the name of the corporation holding Dion's loans?" Charles looked down at his terminal, his eyes scanning the corporate registry data. "It is a holding company," Charles said quietly. "Apex Risk Management Holdings. They own your debt, Richard. They own Dion. They own everything." Brenda began to weep openly, burying her face in her hands, as the sheer magnitude of their ruin settled over the room. Richard sat perfectly still, staring at the unsigned loan application. They were entirely financially paralyzed, stripped of their wealth, and trapped in a cage they had built themselves. Richard slowly stood up, his knees shaking beneath his tailored trousers. He reached out and grabbed Brenda's arm, pulling her up from the chair. They did not say another word to Charles. They turned and walked out of the mahogany office, moving like two ghosts haunting their own funeral. They crossed the expansive marble lobby of the bank, the very place they had entered, feeling like royalty. Now they were leaving as financial hostages. As the heavy glass doors closed behind them, the cold city air hit their faces, carrying the undeniable reality of their situation. They were completely broke, federally exposed, and entirely out of options. The game was over. Richard and Brenda stood outside the bank, their world reduced to ash. Richard pulled his phone and dialed Dion. His voice was hollow. He relayed the name Charles had given him. Apex Risk Management Holdings. That entity was holding the leash. Across town in his doomed office, Dion dropped his phone onto his desk. He stared at the screen, his mind racing. He knew how to track a ghost entity. He cracked his knuckles and began typing frantically, logging into federal tax databases. He needed to know who was holding his execution warrant. Dion searched the registration for Apex Risk Management Holdings. The corporate filings showed it was a newly activated subsidiary formed 48 hours ago. It was registered in Delaware, perfectly shielded to hide its primary beneficiaries. Dion pulled the articles of incorporation, searching for the registered agent. He dug deeper, running the tax identification numbers through a premium commercial database. The layers of the corporate onion began to peel away. Apex was funded by a master trust managed by a secondary risk assessment division. Dion clicked through the digital maze, his heart hammering against his ribs. Finally, the database exposed the parent corporation. The screen loaded a familiar, crisp blue and silver corporate logo. It listed the senior partners. Dion stopped breathing. The parent company was Cassidy's global auditing firm. He stared at the monitor. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. Cassidy did not just expose his Ponzi scheme to the federal authorities. She had mobilized her firm's capital to actively purchase his distressed commercial portfolio from the private lenders. She bought the defaulted loans. She bought the mechanics liens. She bought the cross-collateralized mortgage on Richard's estate. Cassidy did not just know about his debt. She literally owned it. She owned his business, his future, and his freedom. The next morning, the county courthouse was bustling with attorneys and frantic clients. Richard, Brenda, Sloan, and Dion sat huddled together on a hard wooden bench outside the probate courtroom. They looked like refugees from a sunken luxury liner. Their designer clothes could not hide the absolute terror radiating from them. Today was the emergency medical conservatorship hearing. It was their final desperate play. If they could convince the judge that Cassidy was suffering a psychotic break, they could seize her assets, freeze the corporate maneuvers, and save themselves. The heavy courtroom doors swung open. They filed inside, taking their seats behind the petitioner table. They expected Cassidy to walk in, looking frail from surgery or unhinged by the stress. They expected an easy target. Instead, Harrison walked through the double doors alone. He carried a single, slim leather briefcase. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit and radiated the kind of absolute predatory confidence that made other lawyers nervously adjust their ties. He took his seat at the defense table, placing a stack of neatly bound documents before him. Cassidy did not even bother to show up. She did not need to. The judge, a stern man with zero tolerance for frivolous litigation, called the docket. He looked over his glasses at Richard and Dion. "You are petitioning for an emergency medical conservatorship over your daughter, claiming severe mental incompetence and a psychotic break induced by post-operative narcotics," the judge stated, his tone dripping with skepticism. "Yes, Your Honor," Richard said, standing up nervously. "We are deeply concerned for her safety. She has been making wild accusations and acting erratically." Harrison stood up, adjusting his cuffs. "Your Honor, my client Cassidy is a senior partner at a multinational financial firm. She is currently working from a secure corporate suite managing high-level assets. I have submitted sworn affidavits from 3 independent board-certified psychiatrists who evaluated her yesterday. All confirm she is completely lucid, of sound mind, and displaying zero signs of psychological distress or narcotic impairment." The judge flipped through the medical evaluations, nodding. "These are very thorough, Counselor." "There is more, Your Honor," Harrison continued, his voice echoing in the quiet courtroom. "To address the petitioner's claim that my client is incapable of managing her financial affairs, I have submitted Exhibit B. It is a finalized acquisition portfolio, Within the last 48 hours, my client successfully orchestrated and executed the corporate buyout of a multi-million-dollar distressed commercial debt package. She managed a highly complex financial acquisition involving offshore trusts and federal compliance regulations while recovering from gallbladder surgery. Harrison turned slightly locking eyes with Dion. Ironically, the distressed debt she acquired belongs entirely to the petitioners sitting across the aisle. They are facing imminent bankruptcy and federal fraud investigations. They did not file this conservatorship to protect my client, Your Honor. They filed it to steal her personal wealth to cover their own criminal financial exposure. The courtroom fell deathly silent. Brenda covered her mouth, stifling a sob. Dion stared at the floor, entirely broken. Sloane clutched her pregnant belly, shrinking into her chair. The judge reviewed the acquisition documents, his expression hardening into pure judicial fury. He slammed his folder shut and glared down at Richard and Dion. "This court will not be weaponized to facilitate financial extortion," he thundered. "This petition is not just entirely baseless, it is malicious. I am dismissing this conservatorship petition with prejudice. Furthermore, I am forwarding the transcripts of this hearing to the district attorney to review for potential perjury and filing of fraudulent court documents." Richard collapsed back into his chair, his hands shaking uncontrollably. The hunters had officially become the hunted. They walked into the courthouse, hoping to trap Cassidy in a legal cage, but she had used the law to completely obliterate their final escape route. The judge struck his gavel, sealing their fate. They were out of time, out of money, and out of options. Harrison snapped his briefcase shut, offering the ruined family a cold, satisfied smile. He walked out of the courtroom, leaving them to face the absolute devastation they had brought upon themselves. The silence in the wake of Harrison exiting the courtroom was absolute. My family remained frozen on the hard wooden benches. They had walked into that building expecting to strip me of my human rights and my fortune. Instead, they walked out stripped of their dignity, their wealth, and their freedom. The realization of their total defeat did not hit them all at once. It seeped into their bones slowly over the next 24 hours, as the true consequences of their actions materialized. Their bank accounts remained frozen. Dion's creditors began calling Richard's personal phone. The federal marshals assigned to Brenda's grand larceny case requested her immediate presence for questioning. The barrage of communications started the following morning. My phone, which had previously been filled with their arrogant demands and gaslighting threats, was suddenly drowning in pathetic desperation. Richard left 7 voicemails in the span of 3 hours. His tone had undergone a miraculous transformation. The booming authoritarian patriarch was entirely gone, replaced by a trembling, broken old man begging for a lifeline. "Cassidy, please," he pleaded, his voice cracking on the recording. "You proved your point. We have nothing left. The bank is foreclosing. Brenda is terrified of prison. We just need to sit down and talk about this like a family. Please just give us 5 minutes." Sloane resorted to sending lengthy, erratic text messages, alternating between blaming Dion for everything and using her pregnancy as a human shield. Dion attempted to email my firm directly, trying to propose a debt restructuring plan, as if he were still a legitimate businessman and not a cornered criminal. I did not respond to the voicemails. I did not reply to the texts. I forwarded Dion's email directly to the Federal Fraud Division. I let them stew in their absolute terror for 3 full days. I let the reality of their impending ruin completely break their spirits. I wanted them stripped of every last ounce of their unearned arrogance before I allowed them into my presence. On the morning of the 4th day, I finally sent a single unembellished email to Richard. It contained an address, a floor number, and a specific time. 4:00 sharp. There were no pleasantries. There was no greeting. It was not an invitation to a family reconciliation. It was a summons to a corporate execution. The address I provided was not a coffee shop. It was not a neutral restaurant or a comfortable living room. It was the global headquarters of my auditing and risk management firm, a towering monolith of steel and dark glass dominating the downtown skyline. It was the physical manifestation of the career they had spent years mocking and dismissing as boring desk work. When they arrived at the ground floor security desk, they were immediately subjected to the harsh, unyielding reality of my world. They were not treated as the esteemed family members of a senior partner. I had explicitly instructed the security detail to process them as hostile external visitors. Richard, Brenda, Sloan, and Dion were forced to surrender their government-issued identifications, submit to metal detector screenings, and wear bright yellow temporary visitor badges. 2 armed corporate security officers escorted them into a dedicated secure elevator. There was no friendly banter. The guards stood in stony silence as the elevator shot up 50 floors, carrying my family away from the ground level and deep into my domain. When the doors opened, they were guided down a long, quiet corridor, lined with sleek modern artwork and frosted glass doors. The environment was intentionally intimidating, designed to make external contractors and distressed debtors feel small and exposed. The guards led them into Conference Room B. It was a massive, sterile boardroom. 3 of the walls were stark white, while the 4th wall was entirely composed of transparent floor-to-ceiling glass, facing the main operations floor of the firm. In the center of the room sat a massive 20-foot slate table surrounded by rigid ergonomic chairs. The ambient temperature was kept deliberately cool. There was no coffee. There was no bottled water. There was absolutely nothing hospitable about the space. The guards instructed them to take a seat and then walked out, pulling the heavy acoustic door shut behind them. And then, the psychological warfare truly began. I did not walk into the boardroom at 4 o'clock. I made them wait. I sat in my private office, watching the live security feed on my monitor. The glass wall of this boardroom allowed hundreds of my firm's analysts, accountants, and junior partners to walk past and observe the 4 people sitting inside. My family was put on display, trapped in a glass cage in the center of a financial empire they could not comprehend. For the first 20 minutes, Richard paced the length of the room, his hands clasped behind his back. He repeatedly checked his expensive watch, unable to process the fact that someone was intentionally making him wait. He was used to commanding attention, to snapping his fingers, and having the world bend to his schedule. Here he was, absolutely nothing. Brenda sat rigidly in her chair, her designer handbag clutched to her chest like a flotation device. She kept looking out through the glass wall, shrinking under the indifferent gazes of the passing corporate employees. The country club matriarch, who thrived on projecting superiority, was entirely stripped of her power. She looked small, exhausted, and deeply afraid. Dion sat at the far end of the slate table, staring blankly at the polished surface. He was sweating heavily, his tailored suit wrinkling as he slumped in the chair. He recognized the layout of a hostile corporate acquisition room. He knew they were not here to negotiate. They were here to receive their final terms of surrender. Sloan sat next to her mother, nervously bouncing her leg. She kept pulling out her phone, likely hoping to find some escape route on social media, but the thick, reinforced walls of the building deliberately blocked all cellular signals in the guest boardrooms. They were completely cut off from the outside world, unable to call for help or distract themselves from their impending doom. 50 minutes passed, then an hour. The wait was designed to methodically dismantle any lingering sense of familial entitlement. By the time 65 minutes had elapsed, their posture had completely changed. The pacing had stopped. The angry whispering had ceased. They were sitting in total defeated silence. The power dynamic had shifted entirely. They were no longer my parents or my sister or my brother-in-law. They were drowning debtors waiting for the entity that owned their lives to walk through the door. I stood up from my desk and smoothed the lapels of my tailored suit. I picked up a thick stack of legal binders holding the absolute totality of their financial and criminal exposure. I walked down the corridor, my heels clicking against the hardwood floor. The hour of waiting was over. It was time to deliver the final blow. I pushed open the heavy acoustic door of Conference Room B. The sound of the latch clicking echoed like a gunshot in the sterile space. I walked in with Harrison one step behind me. The four people sitting at the massive slate table looked up simultaneously. Their faces were drawn, their eyes red and hollow. There were no warm greetings. There were no hugs or tearful apologies. I did not ask how they were doing, and they did not dare to speak first. The air in the room was freezing, and I brought the winter in with me. I walked to the head of the table and dropped the thick stack of legal binders onto the polished stone surface. The heavy thud made Brenda physically flinch. I did not sit down. I stood towering over them, looking at the pathetic remnants of my supposed family. Cassidy, my father, started, his voice barely a rasp. He reached a trembling hand across the table toward me. "Please, you have to listen to us. We were desperate. We made a terrible mistake." I held up a single finger, silencing him instantly. "You do not get to speak, Richard," I commanded, my voice echoing off the glass walls. "You do not get to offer excuses or play the role of a desperate father. You are not here for a family reconciliation. You are here as defaulted debtors answering to the senior partner of the firm that currently owns your entire existence." I picked up the first binder and slid it down the table. It stopped precisely in front of Dion. I picked up the second binder and slid it toward Richard and Brenda. Sloane stared at the black covers as if they were venomous snakes. "Open them," I instructed. Dion opened his binder with shaking hands. Richard did the same. Inside were hundreds of pages of financial contracts, highlighted bank transfers, and formal notices of default. "Let me explain exactly how you sealed your own fate," I said, pacing slowly behind my chair. "You thought you were being clever by filing an emergency medical conservatorship. You thought you could declare me legally insane, freeze my accounts, and quietly funnel my wealth into Dion's collapsing Ponzi scheme. But you failed to understand the legal ecosystem you stepped into." Harrison stepped forward, resting his hands on the back of his chair. "By attempting to seize Cassidy's personal and corporate-linked assets through fraudulent court filings while simultaneously forging her signature to sell a registered corporate vehicle, you crossed a very specific legal threshold," Harrison explained. "You did not just commit grand larceny and perjury. You triggered a universal breach of fiduciary trust clause." Dion looked up from the binder, his eyes wide with absolute horror. He knew exactly what that clause meant. "For those of you who do not speak corporate finance, I will translate." I continued, staring directly at Brenda. "When a debtor or a guarantor of a debt commits a fraudulent act against the holding institution, it automatically nullifies every single grace period, repayment schedule, and negotiation window in their contract. It is a financial kill switch." I pointed to the binder in Dion's hands. "Apex Risk Management Holdings, the subsidiary of my firm that purchased your toxic commercial portfolio, has officially activated that kill switch. Every single loan you took out to build your fake empire is hereby accelerated. 100% of the principal balance, plus all accrued predatory interest, is due immediately in full." Dion let out a sound that was half sob, half gasp. He buried his face in his hands, his tailored suit straining against his shaking shoulders. "I do not have it," he whispered into his palms. "You know I do not have it. The investors took everything. I am completely empty." "I know," I replied coldly. "Which brings us to the collateral." I turned my attention to my father. Richard was staring at a specific document in his binder. It was the deed to the family estate, highlighting my dormant 50% equity stake alongside the formal notice of foreclosure. "Because you acted as a financial guarantor on Dion's initial loans, your personal assets are cross-collateralized with his commercial debt," I said, my voice mercilessly steady. "And because you explicitly lied on a federal bank loan application yesterday, claiming sole ownership of a property I own half of, you activated the same breach of fiduciary trust clause on your personal estate." Richard looked up at me, his face a mask of pure devastation. "You are taking the house?" he asked, his voice cracking. "You are throwing your mother and me out on the street." "She is not my mother," I snapped my patience, finally breaking for a fraction of a second before I reined it back in. She is a convicted felon waiting to happen, and I am not throwing you out. The bank is. I am simply forcing the legal partition sale of my 50% equity stake. The firm is seizing your half of the liquidated assets to cover the fraudulent losses you and Dion generated. You will leave that property with absolutely nothing. Sloane finally erupted. She slammed her hands on the table, tears streaming down her face. You cannot do this, Cassidy, she screamed, her voice shrill and hysterical. I am pregnant. Where are we supposed to live? How are we supposed to survive? You have millions of dollars. You can just make this go away. You are an absolute monster. I looked at my younger sister, the golden child who had spent her entire life taking what was mine. I leaned over the table, placing both my hands flat on the cool slate, bringing my face level with hers. I did not steal a car to pay off a loan shark, Sloane, I said, my tone razor sharp. I did not lie to a judge to lock my sister in a psychiatric ward. I did not run a Ponzi scheme and rob my friends' retirement accounts. You want to know who the monsters are? Look at the man sitting next to you. Look at the people who raised you. They built a kingdom of lies and expected me to pay the ransom when the walls fell down. I am not a monster, Sloane. I am the consequence. I stood back up, straightening my posture. I looked at the 4 broken people sitting in my boardroom. You have exactly 48 hours, I announced, delivering the final lethal blow. 48 hours from this exact minute. When that clock expires, the firm will formally seize every single asset you possess. We will freeze your remaining bank accounts. We will impound your vehicles. We will take possession of the estate, and we will hand Dion's unredacted audit directly to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Richard tried to stand, his knees buckling slightly. Cassidy, please. 48 hours is not enough time to pack. It is not enough time to find a lawyer. We have nowhere to go. We have absolutely nothing left. Harrison closed his briefcase with a sharp click. Then I suggest you stop wasting time sitting in our boardroom and start packing your bags. I did not wait for their response. I did not stay to watch them cry or beg or turn on each other. The execution was complete. The financial guillotine had dropped, severing them from my life and their stolen wealth forever. I turned my back on them and walked out of the glass boardroom, leaving them trapped in the wreckage of their own making. I had my hand on the heavy acoustic door, ready to walk away and leave them to their doom. But as I pressed the handle, a sudden fracture in the heavy silence behind me made me pause. The absolute stillness of the boardroom shattered. I released the handle, turned around, and leaned back against the cool glass wall. I crossed my arms over my chest, deciding to stay just a little longer. I wanted a front row seat to the main event. I wanted to watch the illusion of their perfect family burn to the ground. Sloane was the first to snap. She slowly turned her head to look at Dion. Her eyes were wide, her makeup slightly smudged from her earlier tears. The reality of the binders sitting on the slate table had finally penetrated her thick layer of entitlement. She looked at the man she had married, the man she had proudly flaunted at her $50,000 gender reveal party. Is it true? Sloane asked, her voice trembling but rising in pitch. Is everything she just said true, Dion? Are you completely broke? Dion shrank back into his ergonomic chair, his tailored suit suddenly looking like a cheap costume. He held his hands up in a defensive gesture, trying to summon the charming developer persona that had fooled so many people. Baby, you need to calm down, he stammered, wiping sweat from his forehead. It is just a cash flow problem. The market shifted. I was going to fix it. I just needed a little more time to move the capital around. You lied to me, Sloane shrieked, the sound bouncing violently off the walls. You told me we were rich. You told me the business was booming. You bought me a diamond necklace last month. How did you pay for that, Dion? Did you steal it from one of Dad's country club friends? Dion looked away, unable to meet her gaze. I did it for us, he muttered. Sloane did not hesitate. She lunged forward across her chair and slapped Dion directly across the face. The sharp crack of her palm striking his cheek echoed like a whip in the sterile boardroom. Dion recoiled, his hand flying up to his face, his eyes wide with shock. "You ruined my life!" Sloane screamed, her voice tearing at the seams. "I am pregnant. I have a baby coming, and you are going to federal prison. You have no money. You have no business. My friends are going to read about this in the news. I have to file for bankruptcy because of you. I am going to be a single mother living in a cheap apartment while you sit in a jail cell. You are a fraud, Dion. You are an absolute fraud." The pristine image of the golden child and her successful husband completely dissolved into a vicious screaming match. Dion finally snapped back, his own panic turning into venom. "Do not act like you did not enjoy the money, Sloane," he yelled, pointing a shaking finger at her. "You never asked where the cash came from when you were booking first-class flights to Europe. You never cared about the accounting when you were swiping black cards at designer boutiques. You spent my fraudulent money just as fast as I could steal it." Brenda watched her daughter's marriage implode, and her survival instincts immediately kicked in. The maternal loyalty she always faked vanished the moment she realized she was the one holding the grand larceny charge. She stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor, and pointed directly at Dion. "This is all his fault," Brenda declared, turning to look at my father. "Richard, you have to believe me. Dion forced me to sell Cassidy's car. He told me violent people were coming after him. He said they were going to hurt Sloane and the baby if I did not get him $150,000 in untraceable cash immediately. I did it to protect our daughter, Richard. I was under extreme duress. He manipulated me into forging that signature." Dion let out a harsh, dark laugh that bordered on hysterical. He looked at Brenda with pure, unadulterated hatred. "You are going to pin the car theft on me, Brenda?" he asked, his voice dripping with malice. "You are going to sit here and tell your husband you stole a corporate asset to save my life?" "It is the truth," Brenda insisted, her voice shrill and desperate. "You threatened me. You made me do it." Dion reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his smartphone. His hands were shaking, but his thumbs moved rapidly across the screen. "You want to talk about the truth?" he growled. "Let us talk about why you really needed that broker. Let us talk about where the rest of that cash went." Dion slammed his phone down on the slate table, sliding it forcefully toward Richard. The screen was illuminated, displaying a long thread of text messages. "Read them," Dion commanded my father. "Read what your loving wife texted me 2 days before the surgery." Richard stared at the phone, his face a mask of dread. He slowly leaned forward and began to read the glowing screen. As his eyes moved over the digital text, the last remaining fragments of his pride withered away. "You have 6 maxed-out credit cards," Richard Dion sneered, narrating the evidence for the room. "Brenda has been hiding the statements from you for 8 months. She owes over $40,000 to luxury boutiques, private jewelers, and her exclusive country club. They were threatening to revoke her membership and sue her for the outstanding balance. She did not forge that signature just to save me from a loan shark. We made a deal. She sold the car, gave me $80,000 to cover my immediate problem, and she kept the remaining $70,000 to pay off her secret shopping addiction before you found out she had bankrupted your personal accounts." Brenda's face turned a sickening shade of gray. "Richard, no!" she gasped, reaching out toward my father. "That is not true. The texts are fake. He is lying." Richard looked up from the phone, his eyes dead. His entire world had been built on the illusion of superiority and control. Now he was sitting in a glass box, realizing his wife was a common thief who stole to fund her vanity. His son-in-law was a con artist who destroyed his retirement, and his golden child was married to a criminal. "You stole from my daughter to buy designer handbags," Richard asked, his voice a hollow rasp. "You risked federal prison to pay your country club dues. You told me you were protecting Sloane. You told me Cassidy was just being cruel." Richard, Brenda sobbed, reaching for his arm. "Please, you have to understand. I had to keep up appearances. I could not let the other women know we were struggling." Richard violently jerked his arm away from her grasp, as if her touch would burn him. "Do not touch me," he snarled. "You lost my house, Brenda. You lost my entire life savings. You lied to me about the credit cards. You lied to me about the car. You are a criminal. You are going to prison and you deserve to be there." The alliance was entirely shattered. The toxic bond that had united them against me for decades evaporated the moment the money ran out. They were no longer a family. They were four cornered animals tearing at each other's throats, desperately trying to throw one another to the wolves to save their own skin. Sloane was weeping hysterically, clutching her stomach. Dion was glaring at his wife and mother-in-law with pure contempt. Brenda was begging a husband who was looking at her with absolute disgust. I stood against the glass wall watching the destruction unfold. I did not interrupt their screaming. I did not offer any commentary. I simply existed in the space, observing the feral self-preservation that defined their true character. They had abused me, manipulated me, and tried to declare me insane. Now they were executing each other right in front of me, and I did not have to lift a single finger. I was the silent architect of their ruin, and watching them tear each other apart was the most satisfying return on investment I had ever received. I took a slow breath, savoring the chaotic symphony of their mutual destruction. For 33 years, they had demanded my obedience. They had demanded my money. They had demanded that I make myself smaller so they could feel larger. They had built an entire ecosystem of lies where I was always the villain and they were always the flawless victims. But the truth is a relentless force. It does not care about your country club reputation or your luxury lease agreements. When the foundation is built on fraud, the collapse is always spectacular. Sloane buried her face in her arms, sobbing so loudly it drowned out Brenda's frantic pleas. Dion just sat there rubbing his temples, completely defeated by his own text messages. Richard stared blankly at the slate table, a man who had finally woken up to the nightmare he had actively nurtured. I pushed off the glass wall, my posture perfectly straight. The show was over. I had seen everything I needed to see. The poison was out of my life forever. I turned my back on the wreckage and reached for the heavy acoustic door handle, ready to leave them to the federal authorities. My hand gripped the cold metal of the acoustic door handle, pressing down to make my final exit. The heavy latch clicked loud and final in the sterile boardroom. I was half a second away from stepping out into the polished corridor and leaving my toxic relatives to the absolute devastation they had engineered. But before I could pull the door open, a sudden sharp sound of movement echoed behind me. A chair scraped violently against the slate floor. "Cassidy, wait." The voice was ragged, stripped of all its former booming authority. I paused, releasing the pressure on the handle, and slowly turned around. My father Richard was moving toward me. The immaculate posture he had maintained for 60 years had completely collapsed. His shoulders were hunched, his tie hung loosely around his neck, and his face was slick with a cold, terrified sweat. He had spent his entire life projecting superiority, relying on his wealth and status to command respect. He had looked down on me my entire existence, viewing me as nothing more than a convenient financial safety net to support his new family. Now the reality of his situation had finally crushed the last remaining fragments of his ego. He was a man who had lost absolutely everything. His sprawling $4 million estate was entering foreclosure. His entire retirement portfolio had been incinerated in Dion's fraudulent Ponzi scheme. His social reputation was radioactive, and his wife was officially facing federal grand larceny charges. He was standing on the edge of total ruin, and he knew that the woman holding the door handle was the only entity on Earth with enough power to stop the freefall. Richard stopped 2 feet away from me. He looked into my eyes, searching desperately for the compliant, obedient daughter he had bullied for 33 years. He found nothing but a reflection of the cold corporate machinery he had underestimated. His knees buckled. It happened so fast that Brenda let out a startled gasp. My father, the arrogant patriarch who had tried to have me declared legally insane just 24 hours ago, physically dropped to the floor. His knees hit the hard slate tile with a heavy thud. He looked up at me from the ground, his hands trembling as he reached out, but dared not touch the fabric of my tailored suit. Please, Cassidy, he begged, his voice breaking into a pathetic sob. Please do not do this. You have made your point. We are broken. I am completely broken. You have to use your influence at the firm. You have to stop the asset seizure and drop the federal charges. I stared down at him. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel the familiar sting of familial obligation that had chained me to them for decades. I felt nothing but clinical detachment. You are asking me to halt a federal investigation and absorb millions of dollars in corporate losses to save people who actively tried to destroy me. I stated, my voice perfectly level. Why would I ever do that, Richard? Because we are family, he pleaded, tears spilling over his eyelashes and tracking down his wrinkled cheeks. We are blood, Cassidy. You can't put your mother in prison. You can't make your pregnant sister homeless. The sheer audacity of his plea hung in the freezing air of the boardroom. He was invoking the very concept of family that he had weaponized against me my entire life. He was demanding loyalty from a daughter he had actively thrown to the wolves. Brenda scrambled out of her chair and rushed to my father's side. She did not kneel, but she hovered over him, her face twisted in terror. She is right, Cassidy, Brenda cried, her voice shrill and desperate. I will go to a federal penitentiary. Dion is going to jail. Sloan will be out on the street with a newborn baby. You have the power to fix this. You have all the money in the world. You cannot do this to your own flesh and blood. Even Sloan chimed in from the far end of the table, clutching her stomach and sobbing uncontrollably. Please, Cassidy, I am sorry. We are all so sorry. Just tell the lawyers it was a mistake. I looked at the three of them. I looked at Dion, who was still paralyzed in his chair, unable to even speak, as his fraudulent empire evaporated around him. I looked down at the man kneeling on the floor, weeping for his lost wealth and his ruined reputation. I took a slow, deliberate breath. The air in my lungs felt crisp and clean. When I was bleeding on an operating table Brenda stole from me, I said, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet register. Every single syllable sliced through their frantic begging like a scalpel. When I was recovering, Dion locked me out of my home. When I needed my father, you tried to declare me legally insane to steal my money. Richard squeezed his eyes shut, flinching as if I had physically struck him. You did not care about blood when you left me stranded. I continued, stepping slightly closer, so he was forced to look up into my eyes. You did not care about family when you filed those court documents to freeze my bank accounts. You did not care about my health, my home, or my sanity. You only cared about covering up a felony and protecting a con artist because it suited your social narrative. But we made a mistake. Richard choked out, his hands clutching his chest. We were desperate. Desperation is an explanation, Richard, not an excuse. I countered, my posture rigid and unyielding. You want to invoke blood now that the game is over. You want to use the word family as a shield against federal indictment. But that is not how the real world operates. Your wife committed grand larceny and interstate trafficking. Your son-in-law operated a multi-million-dollar financial fraud. You committed mortgage fraud. You built a kingdom of lies, and you expected me to be the foundation that held it all up. I leaned down slightly, my gaze locking onto my father's tear-streaked face. Blood didn't stop you, I whispered, the finality of the statement sealing their fate. It won't stop me. Brenda let out a wail of absolute despair, collapsing against the glass wall of the boardroom. Sloan buried her face in her arms, her sobbing echoing loudly. Richard remained on his knees, his head bowing toward the floor, as the last shred of his hope was permanently extinguished. He finally understood that there was no negotiation. There was no secret reservoir of daughterly affection he could tap into. The bridge was completely burned, and he was the one who had supplied the gasoline. I straightened up, breaking eye contact with the man on the floor. I had delivered the verdict. There was nothing left to debate and no more tears for me to witness. The reality of their consequences was now firmly in the hands of the corporate and federal machinery I had set in motion. Harrison stood silently by the table, his expression unreadable as he watched the absolute destruction of my abusers. I gave him a single sharp nod. It was time to close this chapter for good. Harrison stepped forward at my signal, moving with the ruthless efficiency of a corporate shark. He pulled 3 thick manila envelopes from his briefcase and dropped them onto the slate table. The slapping sound of the heavy paper hitting the stone made Brenda flinch violently. Richard remained on the floor, his breathing ragged as he stared up at the lawyer. Dion sat paralyzed, his eyes locked on the envelopes as if they were explosive devices. Sloane clutched her stomach, her weeping echoing off the thick glass walls. "There will be no bailout," Harrison announced with absolute finality. "We are delivering your consequences." Harrison pointed to the first envelope directly in front of Dion. "That contains the receipt of transfer for the forensic audit. Your unredacted Ponzi scheme profile has been formally handed over to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Every fraudulent wire transfer and offshore shell company is now in the hands of federal prosecutors. They have frozen your commercial accounts. You are a primary target of a federal racketeering investigation." Dion let out a hollow, choked sound. He grabbed his hair, pulling at the roots, his curated image entirely obliterated. Harrison shifted his gaze to Brenda, who was trembling like a leaf. "The second envelope outlines your grand larceny charges." Harrison continued mercilessly. "The firm is not dropping the charges. We are actively pushing them forward to the United States Attorney. The federal marshals have initiated the asset recovery protocol. Your claim of duress will not hold up given the digital paper trail proving you kept the illicit funds. You will face severe prison time." Brenda let out a high-pitched wail, sliding down the glass wall until she hit the floor. She curled her knees to her chest, sobbing uncontrollably as the reality of a federal penitentiary cell closed in around her. Finally, Harrison looked down at my father. Richard was still kneeling on the slate tile. His expensive suit wrinkled his face gray and aged. "And for you," Richard Harrison said, tapping the third envelope, "your mortgage fraud triggered an automatic default on your cross-collateralized assets. The firm is initiating immediate foreclosure proceedings on your estate." Richard squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head weakly, as if trying to physically reject the spoken words. Furthermore, Harrison added, "Cassidy is exercising her legal right to force a partition sale of the property. Because you attempted to leverage her 50% equity stake, she is reclaiming her dormant trust assets. The house will be seized and sold at auction. Cassidy will receive her rightful half of the liquidated value. The firm will seize your half to cover a fraction of the debt Dion incurred. You will be left with absolutely nothing." "Please," Richard gasped, reaching a trembling hand up toward the edge of the conference table. "Please, you cannot leave us with nothing. Where are we supposed to go?" "That is no longer our concern," Harrison replied, his tone devoid of pity. "You have exactly 48 hours to vacate the premises before the locks are changed and the property is officially seized by the bank. I highly suggest you spend that limited time packing your belongings rather than begging for a mercy you never once showed my client." The air in the boardroom felt heavy, suffocating under the weight of their total destruction. They had walked into my life demanding my obedience, my money, and my silence. They had treated me like a disposable asset, a human shield to absorb the impact of their disastrous financial choices. Now they were drowning in the exact ruin they forced upon me. I stepped away from the heavy acoustic door and walked back toward the center of the room. I stood tall, looking down at the broken pieces of my former family. Richard was weeping loudly on the floor. Brenda was curled into a tight ball against the glass wall. Dion was staring blankly at the slate table, his mind shattered by the impending federal indictment. Sloane was hyperventilating, her face buried in her arms. They were waiting for a final word, a last sliver of hope or forgiveness. They still believed that somewhere deep down, I was the same desperate girl who just wanted her father to love her. They still thought I would eventually cave to the suffocating pressure of blood and obligation. I looked at them one last time, etching the image of their absolute defeat into my memory. This was the closure I had been waiting for my entire life. I did not need an apology. I did not need an explanation. I just needed them to understand that they could never manipulate me ever again. I reached up and calmly adjusted the lapels of my tailored blazer, smoothing the expensive navy fabric with deliberate precision. The movement was sharp, professional, and entirely devoid of emotion. I turned my back on them. I did not say goodbye. I did not offer any parting words of wisdom or anger. They had taken enough of my breath over the decades, and I was not going to waste another single syllable on their ruin. I walked toward the heavy acoustic door, my heels clicking rhythmically against the slate floor. Behind me, Sloane let out a hysterical scream, begging me to come back, begging me to save her from the nightmare her husband and parents had created. Her frantic cries bounced violently off the glass walls, filling the boardroom with the sound of pure, unfiltered terror. I ignored her. I grasped the cold metal handle, pulled the heavy door open, and stepped out into the brightly lit corporate corridor. I let the door swing shut behind me, hearing the heavy latch click into place, instantly cutting off the sounds of their sobbing. I walked down the hallway, my head held high, leaving them behind forever. And I finally felt at peace in my own life. 2 weeks passed in a blur of relentless legal execution. The deadline I had given them expired, and the corporate machinery of my firm moved with devastating precision. The fallout was not a quiet domestic affair. It was a highly publicized financial massacre that made front-page news across the city. The dominoes I tipped over finally crashed into the ground, and the resulting shockwave leveled their entire existence. It started on a Tuesday morning at the luxury high-rise, where Dion built his fraudulent empire. I watched the live news coverage from the comfort of my office, sipping my morning coffee. A fleet of black SUVs surrounded the glass and steel building. Federal agents wearing tactical vests, emblazoned with the FBI logo, stormed the lobby and commandeered the elevators. They bypassed the receptionist and breached the heavy wooden doors of Dion's executive suite. According to the news anchors, the raid was completely unannounced. Agents confiscated every computer, every physical ledger, and every server in the building. They carried out boxes of evidence, cementing the paper trail my shadow audit had already provided. Then came the main event. The news cameras zoomed in as the federal agents escorted Dion out of the lobby. The charismatic real estate developer who swindled millions from wealthy investors was now wearing steel handcuffs. His bespoke tailored suit looked absurd against the backdrop of federal custody. He kept his head down, avoiding the flashing cameras as they guided him into the back of a waiting government vehicle. The unsealed formal indictment officially charged Dion with multiple counts of wire fraud and operating an interstate Ponzi scheme. The Department of Justice announced he faced a mandatory 10 years in federal prison. The illusion of his success was entirely obliterated, replaced by the cold reality of a concrete cell. Brenda did not fare much better. Federal prosecutors used her international smuggling connection to corner her completely. Terrified of a lengthy federal penitentiary sentence, she took the only exit available and accepted a brutal plea deal. Brenda stood before a federal judge crying genuine tears as she pleaded guilty to lesser charges of financial accessory and fraud. She avoided a long prison sentence, but the leniency ended there. The judge handed down 3 years of strict federal probation and imposed massive financial penalties that officially bankrupted her. Her reputation was vaporized. The Oakmont Country Club formally revoked her membership, citing their bylaws' morality clause. The wealthy friends she had desperately tried to impress cut her off completely, blocking her phone numbers and pretending they had never known her. Brenda had spent her entire adult life clawing her way up the social ladder, stepping on my neck to get there. Now she was a convicted felon, shunned by polite society, and burdened with crushing fines she could never hope to pay. She was relegated to the exact working-class poverty she had always mocked. Sloane experienced a uniquely devastating reality check. The golden child who never worked a day was suddenly stripped of her unlimited funding. With Dion's assets frozen by the federal government and bank accounts seized for investor restitution, Sloane was left with absolutely nothing. Her luxury life vanished overnight. She was forced to file for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. The court-appointed liquidators showed zero sympathy for her pregnant state. They seized her luxury vehicles and auctioned off her jewelry. I received a detailed report from my private investigator confirming her fall. Sloane spent an entire weekend weeping as she sold her designer handbags and luxury shoes to consignment shops just to afford basic groceries. She had to vacate her sprawling suburban rental home and move into a tiny, cheap apartment on the outskirts of the city. The woman who proudly threw a $50,000 gender reveal party was now clipping coupons and navigating public assistance programs entirely alone. And then there was Richard. My father had ignored my existence for decades, choosing the comfort of his new family over his obligations to me. He stood by while they stole from me and actively participated in the plot to declare me insane. Now the consequences of his betrayal finally caught up to him. The foreclosure on the family estate proceeded without delay. The bank seized the property and forced a partition sale exactly as I orchestrated. My 50% equity stake was successfully liquidated, adding a massive cash injection to my portfolio. The remaining funds were entirely absorbed by the bank to cover a fraction of the fraudulent loans Richard guaranteed. He did not receive a single penny from the sale. The massive house he used to project his superiority was sold to the highest bidder. Richard was completely broke. He had no pension, no retirement savings, and no home. He was forced to move into a cheap motel paying weekly rates with whatever cash he could scrape together. The arrogant patriarch was reduced to a desperate homeless man. He tried to call me. He called me every single day. My phone logged the attempts, creating a digital graveyard of his desperation. He left voicemails begging for a second chance, pleading for a small loan just to get back on his feet. He cried into the receiver, telling me he made terrible mistakes and promising to make things right if I would answer the phone. I sat at my desk in my corner office listening to the final voicemail he left. His voice was weak, broken by the absolute ruin of his life. I did not feel a shred of guilt. I did not feel the urge to rescue him. I pulled up my contact list, selected the number belonging to the man who failed me my entire life, and firmly pressed the block button. The bright screen immediately flashed a brief digital confirmation of my choice. The digital cord was permanently severed. I calmly placed the phone face down on my desk. The silence that followed was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. 6 months later, I stood on the expansive glass balcony of my new ultra-luxury penthouse, overlooking the glittering skyline of the city. The crisp evening air whipped around me, but I did not shiver. My health was fully restored. The sharp ache of the surgical incisions that had plagued me during that initial hotel exile had completely faded, leaving behind only a faint silver scar. That scar was a physical reminder of the exact moment my life changed forever. It was the mark of the day I became the architect of my own destiny. I took a deep breath, letting the cool wind fill my lungs. For the first time in 33 years, the air tasted completely clean. There was no more waiting for the other shoe to drop. There was no more anxiety about what disaster my father would expect me to fund, or what crisis my stepmother would use to guilt-trip me. The heavy, suffocating fog of their manipulation had been permanently lifted. I looked down at the streets below, watching the headlights moving like rivers of gold through the concrete canyons. I was entirely untouchable up here. I had purchased this penthouse entirely in cash, a quiet celebration of my newly acquired equity from the forced partition sale of the family estate. It was a fortress of glass and steel, secured by a private elevator and a security detail. Down in the subterranean levels of this building, hidden behind multiple layers of biometric security, sat my ultimate trophy. The 1965 Aston Martin DB5 had been legally recovered by federal authorities shortly after Brenda pleaded guilty in federal court. Victor Thorne had been apprehended before he could load the vehicle into a shipping container bound for overseas buyers. When the federal marshals formally released the asset back into my firm's custody, I personally drove it off the federal impound lot. It now sits gleaming in my private secure garage, completely untouched and perfectly restored. The deep metallic paint catches the overhead lights, and the original leather interior still smells of rich history and unyielding endurance. That car is no longer just a corporate asset or a vintage collectible. It is a beautiful monument to my absolute refusal to be broken. Every time I slide behind the steering wheel and hear the roar of that engine, I am reminded of a truth. I did not just survive a targeted, premeditated attack from my own blood. I systematically dismantled their entire criminal operation and took back exactly what belonged to me. Standing on the balcony, I leaned against the sturdy glass railing and allowed myself to deeply reflect on the true meaning of family. Society conditions us to believe that blood is an unbreakable covenant. We are taught to forgive the unforgivable simply because we share a genetic link with our abusers. We are pressured to turn the other cheek when a parent or a sibling betrays our trust because walking away is somehow viewed as a failure of compassion. But that is a toxic lie designed to keep victims trapped in endless cycles of exploitation. Family is not the group of people who demand your unwavering loyalty while simultaneously picking your pockets. Family is not a mother who steals from you when you are bleeding on an operating table. It is not a sister who views your success as a threat to her own fragile ego, or a father who tries to legally strip you of your sanity to cover up a massive financial crime. Real family is defined by actions, not genetics. Real family are the people who stand by you when you are completely vulnerable and exposed. They are the ones who protect your peace when you are too weak to fight for yourself. Through this ordeal, I realized that I already had a true family. I had built a new family out of incredibly loyal friends and fiercely trusted colleagues. Harrison, David, and Naomi did not just work for my firm. They stood shoulder to shoulder with me in a hotel room, transforming a moment of sheer panic into a brilliant masterclass in strategic survival. They guarded my interests with absolute, unshakable integrity. I also found family in my own unwavering self-respect. For decades, I had sought validation from people who were fundamentally incapable of giving it. I had worked myself to the bone trying to earn a seat at a table that was actively designed to keep me serving the meals. The moment I stopped trying to prove my worth to them, I finally recognized my own inherent value. I am a highly successful woman who commands respect in boardrooms around the world. I am resilient, intelligent, and capable of protecting myself against the most aggressive predators. I am my own greatest ally, and I will never betray my own trust. The silence of my blocked phone was a constant comfort. The energy I used to spend managing their chaotic financial crises is now channeled into expanding my corporate division. I spend my free time mentoring young female auditors who are just starting their careers in the financial sector. I teach them how to spot fraud on a complex balance sheet, and more importantly, how to spot emotional manipulation in a personal relationship. I teach them never to sign away their power, regardless of who is asking. I stepped back from the balcony and walked into the warmth of my penthouse. The city lights sparkled through the massive windows. I raised a cold glass of sparkling water in a silent toast to myself. I survived the raging fire. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is let toxic people face the consequences of their own actions. Have you ever had to draw a hard line with family to protect your own peace? Share your story in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe in standing your ground. Until next time, protect your peace. The story of Cassidy powerfully illustrates that biological ties do not inherently grant a license for exploitation or abuse. Society often conditions individuals to believe that familial loyalty is an unbreakable covenant requiring endless forgiveness regardless of the transgressions committed. However, this narrative reveals the profound danger of that mindset. When family members weaponize guilt, manipulate emotions, and systematically strip away a person's dignity or financial security for their own gain, they forfeit the privilege of that relationship. The most vital lesson here is that establishing ironclad boundaries is not an act of cruelty, but a necessary measure of self-preservation. For decades, Cassidy absorbed the financial and emotional damage inflicted by her father's stepmother and half-sister. She was conditioned to act as their safety net, while they treated her as an outsider. Her turning point did not come from seeking revenge, but from recognizing her own inherent worth and refusing to participate in their toxic ecosystem any longer. True family is not defined by genetics. It is defined by mutual respect, consistent support, and the willingness to protect one another during moments of vulnerability. Cassidy found her real family in the loyal colleagues and professionals who stood by her side when she was hospitalized and betrayed. By holding her abusers entirely accountable and letting them face the natural consequences of their own fraudulent actions, she broke a generational cycle of manipulation. She learned that walking away from toxic blood relatives is not a failure of compassion, but the ultimate victory of self-respect. You do not owe your life or your sanity to people who actively try to destroy it. Take a moment today to evaluate the boundaries in your own life and protect your peace from those who take your loyalty for granted.